Charlotte Bennett's fingers were bleeding before the sun cleared the ridge. She'd knocked on 7 doors that morning. 7. And 7 times the answer was the same: a slow look up, a slow look down, and a door swinging shut in her face. Now she was moving through a blizzard that had no mercy, with nowhere left to go, until she saw a man face down in the snow ahead of her. She recognized those broad shoulders. It was him, the rancher who'd turned her away first. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow along to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The town of Red Creek, Montana Territory had a way of making certain people feel their smallness, not in the quiet, forgettable way of a cold shoulder or an averted glance, but in the loud, deliberate way of men who laughed too long and women who whispered too close together. It was a town built on hard work and harder opinions, and the opinion of Red Creek in the winter of 1878 was that Charlotte Bennett had no business being there. She arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad omen as far as the locals were concerned. Tuesdays in Red Creek were the days the supply wagon came through, which meant the main street was crowded, which meant there were more eyes than usual to watch a heavy-set young woman climb down from the back of a freight hauler with a worn leather satchel and a look on her face that said she intended to stay. She was 24 years old. She had wavy blonde hair that the wind immediately set to ruining bright blue eyes that took in everything around her with careful attention, and a body that the women of Red Creek cataloged and dismissed in the span of about 3 seconds flat. She was big. Not in the way of someone who'd let herself go, but in the deep settled way of a woman who had simply been made that way, wide through the hips, full through the arms and chest, with a softness to her face that was pretty in an honest, unadorned way that Red Creek didn't quite know what to do with. She smoothed the front of her faded blue dress, adjusted the satchel on her shoulder, and walked directly toward the posting board outside the general store. She had a list. She'd made it on the freight hauler in careful handwriting, cross-referencing the names she'd been given in billings against everything she knew about ranching, cooking, animal care, and the kind of hard, practical work that kept a homestead running through a Montana winter. She had skills, real ones, and she had a letter from her last employer, a Mrs. Dora Halverson of Great Falls, that said Charlotte Bennett was the finest combination of cook hand and household manager that Dora Halverson had ever employed, and that any rancher worth his salt would be lucky to have her. Charlotte had read that letter so many times the fold lines had worn soft. She looked at the posting board. 3 ranches were advertising for help. She memorized the names, turned away from the board, and set her jaw against the cold. The first ranch was owned by a man named Aldous Webb. He was a heavy-set man himself, which Charlotte noted without irony, and he had a wife who looked her up and down from the porch, and then spoke to her husband in a low voice that Charlotte was absolutely meant to hear. "Aldous, we can't have that in the kitchen." Charlotte kept her face still. "Mrs. Webb, I have 5 years of experience in—" "We're not hiring," the woman said, and went inside. Aldous Webb had the grace to look uncomfortable. He handed her back her letter without reading it. "Sorry, miss. Wife's made up her mind." The second ranch was a younger operation run by a man named Percival Hatch, who couldn't have been older than 30, and who looked at Charlotte with the particular expression of a man who had been told what to want and was now confronted with something that didn't match the picture. He read her letter. He folded it. He handed it back. "You strong enough for this kind of work?" he asked. "Yes," Charlotte said. "I mean really strong. Winter's coming hard this year. We need someone who can—" "I carried a 200-pound man out of a burning barn in Great Falls 2 winters ago," Charlotte said. "Is there anything else you need to know?" He blinked. I'll think on it." He didn't ask for her to come back. She knew he wouldn't. The third name on her list was Callahan. Wyatt Callahan, the posting had said. Ranch hand and domestic work, winter through spring. See foreman at the main house. Everyone in Red Creek, it turned out, knew the name Wyatt Callahan. She'd heard it 3 times before she even reached his property once, from the boy who pointed her toward the eastern road once, from the woman at the dry goods store who pressed her lips together when Charlotte asked for directions, and once from a group of men outside the saloon who laughed when they heard where she was headed. "Callahan ain't hiring charity cases," one of them said. Charlotte didn't slow down. "Then it's fortunate I'm not one." The Callahan Ranch was the kind of place that told you something about its owner before you ever met him. The fences were straight and well-maintained. The outbuildings were solid. Even in the gray pre-storm light with the sky beginning to press down low and heavy from the north, the property had an order to it, a deliberateness that spoke of a man who paid attention to things that mattered. Charlotte noticed all of this and felt for the first time since arriving in Red Creek something that was almost hope. She knocked at the main house door. A lean older man answered the foreman, she guessed gray-whiskered and weather-cracked with sharp eyes that moved over her quickly and gave away nothing. "I'm Charlotte Bennett," she said. "I'm here about the posting." "You got a letter?" She handed it over. He read it, actually read it, which was more than most had done, and then looked at her again with those unreadable eyes. "Wait here," he said. She waited on the porch for 7 minutes. She counted. When the door opened again, it wasn't the foreman. Wyatt Callahan was taller than she'd expected. He stood in the doorway with the particular ease of a man who owned the ground under his boots and knew it, not arrogant exactly, but settled. He was somewhere in his late 30s, dark-haired, with a face that had been shaped by years of weather and work into something severe and handsome at the same time. He wore a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, despite the cold, and he held her letter loosely in one hand. He looked at her. She looked back. "Miss Bennett," he said. His voice was low and even, with no particular warmth in it. "I'm Wyatt Callahan." "I know," she said. "I've been hearing your name all morning." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, not quite amusement, but the ghost of it. He looked down at the letter. "Says here you managed a household of 8 in Great Falls. Did your own preserving handle the books assisted with foaling season?" "That's correct. Mrs. Halverson speaks highly of you. She's an honest woman." He looked up from the letter. His eyes moved over her in the same way everyone's had, that same cataloging, that same slow assessment that she had learned over 24 years to stand perfectly still through. She didn't shift her weight. She didn't look away. She held his gaze and let him look because there was nothing she could do about what he saw, and she had long since stopped pretending otherwise. "Miss Bennett," he said, and the almost warmth was gone from his voice, now replaced by something careful and formal. "This ranch is not an easy place, especially come winter. The work is hard. The conditions are harder. I need someone who can... I survived 7 winters in a homestead with no central heating, 4 younger siblings, and a father who worked himself into the ground by the time I was 16, Charlotte said. Her voice stayed level. She had practiced level. Level was something she'd built the way you built a fence, one post at a time until it held. I've handled more difficult conditions than most men half again my size. My references will confirm that. If you have specific concerns about my ability to perform the work, I'd ask you to name them plainly, because I'd rather answer a straight question than stand here while you try to find a polite way to say something that isn't polite. The foreman, who had appeared silently at Callahan's shoulder, made a sound that might have been a cough. Callahan looked at her for a long moment. And then something in his jaw set, and she knew before he said a word, she knew that the answer was going to be no. "I appreciate your candor," he said, "and your qualifications are strong. But I don't think this is the right fit, Miss Bennett. I'm sorry for your trouble." He handed the letter back to her. She took it. Her fingers were steady. She folded it and put it back in her satchel and looked at him one last time. "You know," she said quietly, "I've had 7 doors closed in my face since sunup. 6 of them, the people doing the closing, at least had the decency to pretend it wasn't about what I look like." She tilted her head just slightly. "You seem like an honest man, Mr. Callahan. I'd have thought you could manage better than that." She walked off his porch before he could answer. She didn't look back. The snow started 2 hours later. Charlotte had found a room for the night at the town's single boarding house, barely a room, more of a partitioned corner, with a cot and a window that let in more cold than it kept out. And she lay on that cot in the early dark, listening to the wind build outside, and tried to make a plan. She was running low on money. 3 days in Red Creek, maybe 4. If she was careful, and then she would have to make a decision she didn't want to make, which was to go back to Billings and take work at one of the laundries that had offered her a position. And the laundries were fine. The laundries were honest work. But Charlotte Bennett had not traveled 200 miles in the back of a freight hauler to spend the rest of her life standing over a washing vat. She had come here for something better. She was still stubbornly holding on to that. She must have slept because the sound that woke her was the kind of silence that comes after a storm has truly settled in that particular heavy, muffled quiet. That means the world outside has been reorganized by snow, and not gently. She sat up. Through the window she could see nothing but white, and the wind was still moving, rattling the glass in its frame with a persistence that felt personal. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling, and thought about Wyatt Callahan's face when he handed her letter back to her. Not cruel. That was the thing that stuck with her, and that was the thing that was somehow worse than cruelty. He hadn't been cruel. He'd been careful and considered, and ultimately gently dismissive, the way you might turn away a stray dog you didn't dislike but couldn't afford to feed. She had seen dismissal in many forms over the years, and she had built her fence of levelness high enough to withstand most of them. But something about his particular brand of it had gotten through. Maybe because he looked like a man who prided himself on being fair. Maybe because he had almost made her think for one foolish moment on that porch that he was actually reading her letter. She closed her eyes. She would not think about Wyatt Callahan. By morning, the storm had not relented. Charlotte, dressed in everything she owned that could serve as a layer, wound her scarf twice around her neck, and went downstairs to find the boarding house owner, a compact woman named Mrs. Pruitt, standing at the window with her arms crossed, and an expression of profound disapproval directed at the weather. "Stage won't run in this," Mrs. Pruitt said without turning around. "Probably won't run for 2 days at least." "I wasn't planning on taking the stage," Charlotte said. "Where are you planning on going in this?" "There are 2 more ranches I haven't visited yet. The Henley operation and the Mrs. Pruitt finally turned around. She was a small woman, but she had the kind of eyes that had seen everything and were no longer surprised by any of it. "Girl, there is 3 feet of fresh snow on the ground and more coming down. You step outside right now, you will be lost inside of 10 minutes. I have a good sense of direction." "In a blizzard." Mrs. Pruitt's eyebrows rose. "In a place you've never been." Charlotte looked out the window. The snow was still falling dense and steady, and the wind was driving it sideways. Mrs. Pruitt was not wrong. Charlotte knew she was not wrong. "I'll wait until it slows," Charlotte said. It slowed by mid-morning. Not stopped, the snow was still coming down light and persistent, and the wind had dropped from roaring to a steady nagging push, but enough that the road was visible, the outlines of buildings clear, the distance manageable. Charlotte thanked Mrs. Pruitt for the use of the room, settled what she owed, and stepped outside. The Henley Ranch was a 4-mile walk in good conditions. In these conditions, Charlotte estimated an hour and a half, maybe 2. She set a pace that was deliberate and sustainable, and kept her mind on the work of it, the lift and placement of each foot through the drifted snow, the conservation of warmth, the reading of landmarks against the white blurred landscape. She had grown up in country like this. Cold did not frighten her. Cold was simply a problem to solve. She was perhaps a mile out of town when she saw the shape in the snow. It was off to the right of the road, near the tree line, half buried by the drift that had built up against the fence posts of a property she recognized even through the snow as the Callahan spread. The shape was wrong, too large for a fallen branch, too still for an animal. She stopped walking. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she left the road. The snow was deeper off the road, up past her knees in places, and her dress was soaked through before she'd covered a quarter of the distance. She didn't slow down. The shape was resolving as she got closer. Dark fabric, dark hair, a broad back, dusted with white, and she already knew what it was before she was close enough to be certain. Wyatt Callahan was face down in the snow, one arm thrown out ahead of him, perfectly still. She dropped to her knees beside him and got her hands on his shoulder and his hip and turned him over, which took more effort than she would have liked to admit, because he was a big man, and dead weight is always heavier than live weight, and the cold had already started its work on him. His face was gray-white. His lips had a blue tinge. His pulse, when she pressed her fingers to his neck, was there, weak and too slow, but there. "Mr. Callahan?" She put her hand against his cheek hard. "Mr. Callahan?" Nothing. She looked around. The ranch house was visible from here, maybe 150 yards through the snow. 150 yards. She was a strong woman. She had always been a strong woman, bigger than most of the men who'd looked at her like she was somehow less than them, with arms and legs that had been doing serious work since she was 12 years old. But 150 yards through knee-deep snow, dragging an unconscious man who weighed somewhere around 200 pounds with her own body, already taxed by an hour of cold weather walking, she looked at his face. She thought about what he'd said to her. "I don't think this is the right fit." She thought about Mrs. Webb, and her voice like a door slamming. She thought about Percival Hatch and his doubtful eyes. She thought about the men outside the saloon laughing. She got her hands under his arms. "Mr. Callahan?" Her voice came out sharp and loud, and she felt him flinch barely, almost nothing but a flinch. "I need you to hear me. I am going to get you inside, but I cannot do it alone. I need whatever you have left in you. Do you understand?" His eyelids moved, just slightly. "Good," she said. "That's good. Hold on to that." She started pulling. It was the hardest thing she had done in a life that had contained a considerable number of hard things. Her feet kept breaking through the snow crust and sinking, and every time she regained her footing, it cost her something she wasn't sure she had left to spend. Callahan was barely conscious. She could feel him trying to respond when she spoke to him, trying to get his legs to work in some useful direction. But the cold had taken too much of him, and he was more hindrance than help. Her shoulders screamed. Her back was a solid wall of pain. Her hands, gripping the thick fabric of his coat, had passed through cold and into a kind of burning numbness that she tried not to think about too directly. "Keep going," she said, out loud, to herself as much as to him. "Keep going, keep going, keep going." He made a sound, low, rough, barely human. "I know," she said. "I know. Almost there." It wasn't almost there. It was still 100 yards, then 80, then 60. The snow kept falling. The wind found every gap in her layering and pushed cold air through it like a knife. She counted. She had always counted when things got bad: 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, something for her mind to hold on to while her body did what her body needed to do. At 40 yards, his boots found something useful, and he got one leg underneath himself, and that was enough. Not much, but enough. The difference between her dragging him and something closer to the two of them moving together, however awkwardly, however slowly. "That's it," she said. Her voice had gone ragged. "Right there. That's it." "Who?" His voice was barely there, cracked. "Who are you?" "Charlotte Bennett," she said between breaths. "You turned me away from a job yesterday. We can discuss the irony of that later." She got them to the porch. She got the door open. It wasn't locked. Thank God it wasn't locked. And she got him through it and down onto the floor, just inside, because she could not get him any further than that, not immediately. She let herself collapse against the wall beside him for exactly 20 seconds. She counted those too. Then she got up. Chaddag. The foreman, the gray-whiskered man from the day before, whose name she had since learned was Hector, found her 40 minutes later, building up the fire she'd found dying in the main room hearth, with Wyatt Callahan wrapped in every blanket she'd been able to locate lying on the floor, as close to the growing warmth as she'd dared put him. Hector stood in the doorway. He looked at Callahan. He looked at Charlotte. He looked at the fire. "Lord Almighty," he said. "He needs a doctor," Charlotte said. She didn't look up from the fire. Is there one in town? Doc Merritt, I'll... Hector stopped. How did he get in here? I brought him in. She added another log. He was by the tree line near the east fence. I don't know how long he'd been down. Silence. Miss, Hector said, and his voice had changed, the wariness in it replaced by something that sounded almost like awe. He weighs 220 if he weighs a pound. I'm aware, Charlotte said. Please go get the doctor, mister. Hector, just Hector. Hector, please go get the doctor. He went. She stayed where she was beside the fire and watched Callahan's chest rise and fall. His color was coming back slowly, the gray-white of deep cold, giving way to something that was closer to the living color of a man who might actually survive this. His breathing had steadied. When she'd gotten him inside and started working on his boots and wet outer layers, a task she'd accomplished with an efficiency born entirely of necessity, and not a single other thought, he'd drifted back toward unconsciousness. Now he was somewhere between not quite awake, not quite under. She should have felt something about the situation. Something pointed, or satisfying, or at the very least, strange. The man who had looked at her and found her wanting lying at her feet alive because of her. There was probably some clean, simple emotion that the circumstances called for. What she felt mostly was tired, and a little cold still in her hands. And she thought that if she never walked through a blizzard again in her life, that would be entirely fine. Wyatt Callahan opened his eyes to firelight and a ceiling he recognized as his own. For a moment that was all he knew, ceiling firelight warmth that had the particular quality of warmth earned after serious cold. He lay still and took stock. His body felt like it had been wrung out and put back wrong. His hands ached. His feet ached in a deeper way that he knew from experience meant they'd gotten close to something you didn't come back from easily. He turned his head. She was sitting in the chair beside the fire. His foreman's old wool blanket around her shoulders, her eyes closed, her head tipped back slightly. Her blonde hair had come loose from whatever she'd had it pinned into, and it was still damp at the edges. She had her hands wrapped around a tin mug that had probably gone cold some time ago. He stared at her for a full 30 seconds before he was certain he wasn't dreaming or delirious. "Miss Bennett," he said. His voice came out as a wreck. Her eyes opened immediately. She was on her feet before he'd finished saying her name, crossing to him and crouching down with a brisk competence that suggested she'd been doing this long enough that his waking up was just the next task on a list. She put the back of her hand against his forehead. She checked his pulse with 2 fingers at his wrist. She looked at his eyes with an attention that was purely clinical. "Your color's better," she said. "How's your hands and feet?" "Painful," he admitted. "That's good. Pain means the blood's coming back." She sat back on her heels. "You've been unconscious most of the afternoon. Dr. Merritt was here. He'll be back tomorrow." "Dr. Merritt was..." He stopped. "How long?" "Long enough." She stood up and went back to the fire and added a log with the practiced ease of someone who had been tending his hearth for hours. "Do you know what happened?" He was quiet for a moment. "My horse," he said finally. "I was checking the east fence before the storm got worse. She slipped on the ice and went down. I went over her head." He stopped. "I tried to get up. I couldn't get my legs under me right." "You likely hit your head on the fence post," Charlotte said without turning around. "Dr. Merritt said there's bruising. He said it's a wonder you didn't crack your skull. How did you..." He stopped again. He looked at her back, at the set of her shoulders, at the practical, unhurried way she was working. "You found me. I was walking to the Henley Ranch." She finally turned around. Her face was calm. No particular expression in it. "You were by the east fence, in the snow." He was quiet. 150 yards, he said. Not quite a question. "About that." He looked at the ceiling. He was a man who had spent the better part of his life being the one who handled things his own land, his own problems, his own survival. He was not a man accustomed to being handled. He was not a man accustomed to owing. "Miss Bennett," he said, You don't need to say anything, Mr. Callahan. I owe you my life. You owe me nothing, she said. Her voice was steady and flat, and entirely without drama. I would have done the same for anyone I found in that condition. He turned his head to look at her again. She was looking at the fire. I was wrong yesterday, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said. You were. The word landed without decoration, without softening, without any of the hedging he might have expected from a woman in her position. Just yes. Just the plain truth of it, delivered without apology for the plainness. He found, despite everything, that he almost smiled. Hector tells me, he said slowly, that you carried me. Hector talks too much. He says you dragged me across the snow for 150 yards in the middle of a blizzard. I had help toward the end. You got a leg under yourself. One leg. It was useful, she said. The ghost of something moved across her face, not quite humor, but close. Every bit counts. He was quiet again. The fire was warm. Outside he could hear the wind still working at the eaves, but it had a different quality now farther away, or perhaps he was simply farther from it. I'd like to offer you the position, he said. The one you applied for. She looked at him then, really looked at him with those clear, careful eyes. Mr. Callahan, she said, if you're offering me a job because you feel obligated, I'm offering you a job because Hector informed me about 2 hours ago that you also managed to keep this fire burning warmed water for the compresses on my feet, inventoried what was in the kitchen, and started something for supper, and corrected the filing system in my front office, which apparently he's been trying to organize properly for 6 months. He paused. He seems very taken with you. Something shifted in her face. The filing system was a disaster, she said. He says you fixed it in 40 minutes. It was closer to 30. He looked at her. She looked at him. And for the first time since she'd walked onto his porch the day before, there was something between them that wasn't a closed door or an unanswered question, something smaller and quieter, and he thought more honest. It's not pity, he said quietly. I want that to be plain. I'll need it in writing, she said. The terms. Hours, pay, responsibilities. I don't work on handshakes. Fair enough. And I'll need a room that doesn't share a wall with the bunkhouse. There's a room off the kitchen that's been empty since... He stopped. It's empty. It'll suit. She nodded once. She picked up her tin mug, looked at the cold coffee in it, and set it back down with the expression of a woman who had better things to do than lament cold coffee. Try to sleep, she said. Dr. Merritt will want to see you moving under your own power by tomorrow morning. Miss Bennett. She stopped. Thank you, he said. Not for the position, for the other thing. She stood in the firelight, her damp hair catching the warmth of it. Her expression doing something complicated that she seemed to decide after a moment not to finish. Get some sleep. Mr. Callahan, she said. She walked out of the room. He lay there for a long time, after listening to the fire and the distant wind, thinking about what it felt like to be wrong about something, to have made a judgment that cost you nothing in the moment, and could have cost you everything, and to have been saved anyway by the very person you'd dismissed. He didn't have a word for what that was. He suspected it was the kind of thing that took a while to properly understand. Outside, in the dark cold of the hallway that led to the kitchen, Charlotte stood with her back against the wall and let herself shake, just for a moment, just the 30 seconds she'd been holding back all afternoon. Her hands were trembling with exhaustion she hadn't let herself feel while there was still work to do, and her shoulders ached with a deep, bone-level soreness that she knew would be considerably worse by morning. She stood there and she shook and she breathed, and then she stopped shaking and straightened up and went to check on the stew she'd left simmering, because it would need stirring, and the biscuits she'd started would need to come out of the oven, and there was a kitchen to close down for the night, and she had a job, and she intended to do it. The snow had stopped falling somewhere around dusk. Through the kitchen window, the world outside was white and still and very cold, and the stars were beginning to appear at the edges of the sky, in the particular way they appeared after a storm, sharp and clean, and more numerous than you remembered them being. Charlotte looked at them for a moment. Then she stirred the stew. Hector was the first one to notice. He'd been working the Callahan ranch for 11 years, through 2 hard winters, and a drought that had taken half the valley's cattle, and in all that time, he had never once seen Wyatt Callahan stay in bed past 4 in the morning. Callahan was the kind of man who treated sleep like a debt he paid reluctantly and reclaimed as soon as possible. So when the morning after the blizzard came and went with no sign of the boss, and then the morning after that, Hector knew the cold had taken more out of him than either of them had let on. What Hector hadn't expected was Charlotte Bennett. He came into the kitchen on that second morning to find her already at the stove, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had mapped the space in her mind and committed it to memory. She had the fire-going strong coffee on, and something in the cast iron that smelled like it was going to be the best breakfast the Callahan ranch had seen in a considerable number of years. She was wearing the same dress she'd arrived in clean now, though slightly worse for the adventures of the day before, and she had her hair pulled back and her sleeves rolled up to the elbow, and she was doing 3 things at once with the focused calm of a woman who had been doing 3 things at once since before most people were out of bed. Hector stood in the doorway. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Coffee's ready. Eggs in about 10 minutes. I found salt pork in the cellar. I hope that's all right." He sat down at the table without being invited to, and wrapped both hands around the mug she set in front of him. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Charlotte," she said. "Miss Bennett is what they call me when they're about to tell me no." He looked at her. She was already back at the stove. "Charlotte, then," he said. "How'd you sleep?" "Well enough." A small pause. "The room off the kitchen is cold in the morning. I'll need to sort out the draft situation in that window before next week." "I've been meaning to get to that for, He stopped. "How'd you know about the draft?" "Because I slept in the room," she said with the patience of someone explaining something to a perfectly intelligent person who simply hadn't caught up yet. "And I could feel it." He drank his coffee. It was considerably better than what he'd been making for himself for the past several months. He thought about saying so and decided she probably already knew. "Boss is awake," he said. "Heard him moving around upstairs before I came down." "I know. I looked in on him an hour ago. His color's good, and his feet are responding the way they should. The headache is still there, but the confusion is gone." Hector put his mug down. "You looked in on him." "Someone needed to." He did the math. "At 5 in the morning. It was closer to 4:30. She plated his eggs with a brisk efficiency that gave him no time to respond to that, set the plate in front of him, and turned back to the stove. "I'll take something up for him once you've eaten. He shouldn't be moving around more than necessary today." Hector stared at his plate. He stared at the back of her head. He picked up his fork. "Doc Merritt's coming back this morning," he said. "I know. I sent one of the hands with a note last night." He chewed. He thought about the 6 months he'd spent trying to keep the Callahan household functioning since the last housekeeper had left the meals that had been approximate at best, the books that had developed a slow-spreading chaos that he didn't have the particular skill set to address. He thought about the filing system she'd apparently reorganized in 30 minutes. "You're something else," he said mostly to himself. She didn't answer, but he thought watching her profile that the corner of her mouth moved. Wyatt heard her coming up the stairs before she knocked, not because she was heavy-footed, but because he'd been lying awake listening for the sound since 4:30, when he'd heard her quiet step in the hallway outside his door, and then heard it move on past, and had spent the subsequent time arguing with himself about why he was tracking her movements through his own house. "Come in," he said. She came in with a tray, coffee biscuits, something that smelled like it had actual seasoning in it, and set it on the side table without fuss. She looked at him with that same clinical attention she'd had the night before, quick and thorough. "Head still hurting?" she asked. "Some." "Where, front or back?" "Back, behind the left ear." She nodded. "That's consistent with where you hit the post. It'll likely be worse today than yesterday, and better by day after tomorrow." If it moves to the front of your head or you start getting vision trouble, you tell me immediately." He looked at her. "Are you a doctor, Miss Bennett?" "I'm a woman who has handled a fair number of injuries in situations where a doctor wasn't available," she said. "My father broke his collarbone when I was 15 and the nearest doctor was 40 miles out. You learn what you need to learn." She picked up the tray and set it across his lap with a practicality that left no room for argument. "Eat. Dr. Merritt will be here by mid-morning." He looked at the tray. He looked at her. "Sit down," he said. She paused. "Please," he said, "if you have a moment." She considered him for a beat, then pulled the chair from the corner and sat in it with the upright posture of someone who had been taught, probably repeatedly, that the way you held yourself told people what you thought you were worth. Her hands rested in her lap. She waited. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said on my porch." "Which part of it?" "The part about the other 6 doors." He looked at his coffee. "You said 6 of them had the decency to pretend it wasn't about what you look like." She was quiet. "You were right," he said, "about what you implied." "I wasn't implying anything," she said. "I was saying it plainly. Fair." He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug, more for the warmth than the need to hold something, though he suspected it was partly that, too. "I want you to know that I—" He stopped, started again. "I had reasons that had nothing to do with Mr. Callahan." Her voice was not unkind, but it was direct in the way of a woman who had used up her patience for gentle misdirection sometime around her 17th birthday. "You don't need to explain yourself to me. You hired me. That's where we are now. I want to explain it anyway." She looked at him. "My last housekeeper left because the work was too hard," he said. "The one before that left because she was afraid of the isolation. I've had 3 people in 4 years, and every time someone leaves the ranch, loses ground that takes months to make up. I told myself I was being practical, that I needed to be certain, that I was looking at capability and durability, not—" He stopped. "But you're right that what I was actually doing was making a judgment about capability based on something that had nothing to do with it." The silence stretched out. "And?" Charlotte said. He looked at her. "And what?" "You're a man who looks like he's used to finishing his sentences." Something shifted in his chest. Almost humor. "And I was wrong," he said. "That's the rest of it. I was wrong, and it is possible that my being wrong could have cost me my life, and I would like that to be said plainly between us so that we can both move forward from it." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She had eyes that were difficult to read quickly, and even harder to read slowly, not because they were guarded exactly, but because they had the quality of eyes that had learned to take in more than they gave back, the way a person who has been surprised by cruelty tends to watch the world more carefully ever after. "All right," she said finally. "All right," it said. "We can move forward." She smoothed the front of her dress and looked at the tray. "Eat the biscuits while they're warm. Cold biscuits are a moral failing." He looked at the biscuits. He looked at her. "Miss Bennett," he said. She stopped at the door. "Were you really going to the Henley Ranch?" She turned slightly. "Yes." "To apply for a position there?" "Yes." "In the middle of a blizzard." It had slowed, she said with the particular dignity of a woman who did not intend to be made to feel ridiculous for her own survival. "And I had a limited number of days before my funds ran out. The storm wasn't going to stop being a storm just because it was inconvenient." She paused. "The Henley Ranch is 4 miles east." He thought about that. He thought about where he'd been found, the east fence. "You would have walked right past where I was," he said. "I did walk right past where you were," she said. "About 30 yards into the tree line on the way back from where I was going, except I was coming toward it from the road, and you were on the inside of the fence." She met his eyes. "If you'd fallen on the other side, I wouldn't have seen you." He let that sit in the air between them for a moment. "Eat the biscuits," she said, and left. Dr. Merritt arrived at mid-morning, a wiry, precise man who had the particular manner of small-town doctors, which was to say he was simultaneously brusque and deeply kind. And he moved through the examination of Wyatt Callahan with efficient hands and sharp eyes that occasionally flicked toward Charlotte with a curiosity he was too professional to voice directly. He voiced it on the way out, though. Charlotte was in the front hallway, making a list of what the kitchen needed that she would give to Hector to take into town when Dr. Merritt paused beside her on his way to the door. "You got him inside," he said, not accusatory, just checking the facts. "Yes." "And you kept the fire going, did the foot compresses?" "Yes." He looked at her with those sharp eyes. "What's your name?" "Charlotte Bennett. I'm the new housekeeper." He nodded slowly. "You got any nursing experience?" "Not formal." He picked up his bag. "Well, you probably saved his feet, Miss Bennett. He was close to losing them." He said it without drama, which somehow made it worse. Another hour in that cold, we'd have been talking about a very different conversation. He left. Charlotte stood in the hallway for a moment after the door closed. She thought about Wyatt Callahan's boots, which she had gotten off him in the cold of the entryway while he was barely conscious, and his feet, which had been white and unresponsive in a way that had sent something cold through her chest that she had not allowed herself to examine too closely. She had done what she knew to do. Warmth gradual, not too fast. She had learned that at 15 when her youngest brother had fallen through the ice on the creek behind their homestead, and she had been the one who pulled him out. You learn what you need to learn. She went back to her list. Tag. The ranch hands were another matter. There were 4 of them permanent hands who'd been through at least one winter on the Callahan spread, which gave them a particular sense of ownership over the rhythms of the place. Their names were Dale Rupert, a young man everyone called Stick, for reasons Charlotte did not immediately inquire about, and a weathered silent figure named Amos, who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat brim and the direction of his tobacco spit. They arrived at the back door for their noon meal on Charlotte's second day, with the combined energy of men who had heard something that amused them and were managing that amusement with varying degrees of success. Dale was the least successful. He was a big man with a broad red face, and the kind of laugh that preceded whatever he thought was funny by about 3 seconds, so Charlotte heard it coming before he even got through the door. "So you're the one who hauled the boss out of the snow," he said by way of greeting. Charlotte set 4 plates on the table. "Wash your hands before you sit." A brief, surprised pause from all 4 of them. "Ma'am?" "There's a basin and soap at the back step," she said. "Use it." Another pause. Then, to her faint internal satisfaction, she heard the sound of them actually doing it. She had learned over years of managing households where she had no natural authority and had to build it from scratch that the first 10 minutes set the terms of everything that followed. You were either someone the kitchen listened to, or you were someone it worked around. She intended to be someone it listened to. They came back in and sat down with the subdued quality of men who were not entirely sure what had just happened but were reasonably sure they'd ended up on the back foot somehow. Dale tried again. "Must have been something, though. He weighs a ton, the boss does." "He weighs 220, Charlotte said, sitting down with her own plate. She had decided on her first morning that she would eat at the table with the hands if they ate in the kitchen, which they apparently did in winter. It was either that or eat alone, and she had eaten alone enough in her life. And he was dead weight for about the first 100 yards, so yes, it was something. More coffee. Stick, who was in fact very thin, which explained the name, looked at her with the open, unselfconscious stare of someone young enough to not yet have learned that staring was rude. "How'd you manage it? You don't look—" He stopped. "Strong," Charlotte suggested pleasantly. Stick had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I was going to say experienced. I grew up on a homestead in a family of 5 children," she said. "I've been doing heavy work since I was old enough to do it. You want to know what builds real strength? Not avoiding the hard things. Doing them anyway long enough that they stop being hard." She looked around the table. The stew's better if you eat it hot." There was a pause in which 4 men simultaneously decided that the stew was in fact what they should be focusing on. Amos, without looking up from his bowl, said his first words in Charlotte's presence, which were good biscuits. "Thank you," she said. Rupert, who had a thoughtful look that the others lacked, said, "You stayin' on then?" "Permanent." "Mr. Callahan offered me the position. I accepted it." "Huh." Rupert looked at his stew. "He's not easy to work for, you know. Not mean, just particular." "I'm particular too," Charlotte said. "We'll figure it out." Hector, who had slipped in during this exchange and taken his usual place at the end of the table, was watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of approval, which was to say, he looked slightly less skeptical than usual. "She fixed the filing system," he told the table, as if this explained something. "What filing system?" Dale said. "Exactly," said Hector. Wyatt came downstairs on the 3rd day. He shouldn't have, and Charlotte told him so directly when she heard his step on the stairs, and came to the bottom to find him negotiating the last 4 steps, with a careful deliberateness that made it obvious his head was still not right. "Dr. Merritt said to rest," she said. "Dr. Merritt isn't a rancher," Wyatt said, making it to the bottom step with what he probably imagined was steady dignity. "There's work that needs doing. There are 4 hands and a foreman doing it," she said. "The ranch will survive 2 more days without you." He looked at her. "Miss Bennett." "You're pale," she said. "And you've got the tight look around your eyes that means the headache is worse than you want to say. If you push this and something goes wrong in that head of yours, you could do permanent damage. Is there a fence that needs mending that's worth that?" He was quiet for a moment. She could see him weighing it, the particular internal calculation of a man who was used to being the one who kept everything moving, who had built his entire sense of usefulness on his physical capacity to show up and work and not quit. "No," he said finally. "No, there isn't." "Then sit down somewhere warm and tell me what paperwork is most urgent. I can read and write and do figures, and Hector can brief me on anything operational." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was closer to the look of a man who had just had something he'd built his identity around, quietly reorganized by someone who hadn't asked permission. "You're very bossy," he said. "For a housekeeper." "I'm very good," she said. "For a housekeeper. The bossiness comes with it. Come sit by the fire." He came. And whether it was the head injury or something else, he stayed there for the better part of the morning, while she sat at the desk in the corner with the ranch's account books open in front of her, and worked through 3 months of figures with a focused attention that eventually drew him out of his chair and over to stand behind her, looking at what she'd found. "This column," she said, not looking up. "Somebody's been recording the feed costs twice. Once in supplies and once in operational maintenance. You've been overstating your costs by about 15% for 3 months. Silence. He stopped. "That's a significant error. It's fixable. I can have it corrected by the end of the day if nothing else needs my attention. But you should know that whoever did the books before me was either careless or didn't understand how the categories were meant to function." "I did the books," he said. A pause. "Ah," Charlotte said. "I'm a rancher," he said, with the particular dignity of a man defending something he knows is not his strongest suit. "The books are, they're not your strong suit," she said. "That's all right. Not everyone's is. You built a very well-ordered operation out there. The fencing alone would take most men twice as long to maintain. That's its own skill." He was quiet for a moment. "You're trying to make me feel better about the books." "I'm trying to be accurate about what I see," she said, and finally looked up at him, which is a man who's very good at some things and less good at others, which describes every person I've ever met. The difference is, most of them can't admit it. "Can I ask you something?" He looked slightly wary. "Go on." "The last 3 housekeepers, why did they really leave?" He went still. Hector told me 2 of them left because the work was too hard, and 1 left because of the isolation, she said. And maybe that's true. But there's something in this house, in the books, in the way the kitchen was organized, in the way the supply orders are set up, that tells me someone who was here for a while cared about this place and then left suddenly, and not because of hard work. The silence was long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. She turned back to the books. "My wife," he said. She stopped. "She died 3 years ago," he said. His voice was even the evenness of a man who had said the words enough times that they'd worn smooth. "She set up the kitchen. She started the filing system. She organized the supply orders." A pause. "The last 3 housekeepers, I think they could feel it. That nothing was really meant for them. That everything in the house was still arranged for someone else." He stopped. "I didn't realize that was what was happening until the 3rd one told me on her way out that she'd never felt like anything other than a guest in my house." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She looked at the account books. She thought about the kitchen, the way things had been arranged in a way that had seemed almost right, but not quite, like a song played in the wrong key. She thought about the filing system, which had been started and then left half-finished in a way that made it worse than no system at all. She thought about the room off the kitchen, which was cold and slightly bare in a way that suggested it had been used for storage before someone had hastily cleared it out. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your wife." "Thank you. What was her name?" He looked at her. People didn't ask that usually. They offered condolences and moved on and treated the dead with the careful distance of something too close to look at directly. "Margaret," he said. "Maggie." Charlotte nodded. "She had good instincts," she said, gesturing at the kitchen with a slight tilt of her head. "The basic structure is sound. It just hasn't been maintained in a direction since she left. I'll work with what she built, not around it." She paused. "If that's all right." Something moved through his face, gone before she could name it. "Yes," he said. Yes. That's all right." She turned back to the books. He stood there for a moment and she was aware of him. The way you're aware of a fire in the room, not looking at it directly, but knowing exactly where it was. And then he went back to his chair and she heard him sit down and pick up something from the side table. They stayed like that for the rest of the morning. Not talking, just present in the same room in the way of people who were beginning slowly and without ceremony to not be strangers to each other. The trouble started on the 5th day. It came from the direction of Aldous Webb's ranch, which was not, Charlotte would later reflect, entirely surprising. It came in the form of Webb's wife, a sharp-faced woman named Greta, who arrived at the Callahan door with 2 other women from town. All 3 of them dressed for a social call, in a way that made it clear they were not there for social purposes. Charlotte answered the door. Greta Webb looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has rehearsed what she intends to say and is annoyed to find the first line of it doesn't quite fit the person she's delivering it to. She'd clearly expected the door to be answered by Hector. "We're here to see Mr. Callahan," she said. "He's resting," Charlotte said. "Is there something I can help you with?" Greta's eyes moved over her in the way Charlotte had learned to recognize that particular inventory that women sometimes took of other women, the kind that was less about what they saw and more about what they were deciding. "You're the new girl," she said. "I'm the housekeeper," Charlotte said. "Charlotte Bennett." "Yes." Greta drew the word out slightly. "We'd heard there was someone new out here. It's quite unusual, a young woman living on a ranch with a widower." The 2 women behind Greta managed to look simultaneously prim and deeply interested. "Mr. Callahan employs a foreman and 4 hands," Charlotte said pleasantly. "It's quite a full household. Was there a message you'd like me to pass along to him?" "We'd prefer to speak with him directly," Greta said. "Of course. If you leave your names, I'll let him know you called and he can—" "Miss Bennett." Wyatt's voice came from the hallway behind her. She turned to find him standing there, looking better than he had 2 days ago. The color back in his face, though she could still see the slight tightness around his eyes that she'd come to recognize as pain, he wasn't admitting to. She looked at him with an expression she hoped conveyed the words, "You should not be on your feet," without saying them directly, because he would find them easier to ignore if she said them in front of guests. He seemed to receive the message. He didn't retreat, but he also didn't move toward the door. "Mrs. Webb," he said. "Ladies, thank you for coming by." "Wyatt." Greta stepped past Charlotte into the hall with the ease of a woman who had decided the door being answered by an employee was a formality and not a boundary. "We've been so concerned. The whole town has. We heard about your accident." "I'm recovering well, thank you." "Yes, I can see that." Her eyes moved to Charlotte, then back. "We heard that your new employee found you. How fortunate." "It was," Wyatt said. His voice was neutral, careful. "Several people in town have expressed concern," Greta said, deploying the word with the precision of someone who knows exactly what they're actually saying. "About the arrangement here. An unmarried young woman living and working in a household with a man alone. People talk, Wyatt. You know how people talk." Charlotte stood to the side of the hallway and said nothing. She had learned at some cost over the years when a conversation was about her and not for her. "There are 5 other men on this property," Wyatt said. His voice had not changed, but something under it had. Something had cooled. "And Miss Bennett's professional qualifications are—" "Oh, qualifications," Greta said with a small laugh that was not a laugh. "Of course, though I will say it does seem unusual, for you to take on help so quickly, after everything, Mrs. Webb." Wyatt said her name quietly, and the quietness of it stopped her. "Miss Bennett saved my life. She pulled me out of a blizzard in which I would have died. She managed this household through my recovery with a skill and a professionalism that I have not seen in this house in 3 years." He paused. "If the town of Red Creek has concerns about my hiring practices, they are welcome to bring them to me directly. I'll hear them, but I'd ask that those concerns be expressed to me and not in the form of implications directed at an employee in my own home." Greta Webb's face underwent a complicated series of adjustments. "Well," she said, "I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Wyatt said. "Thank you for stopping by. Charlotte, would you show Mrs. Webb and her friends out?" It was the first time he'd used her given name. Charlotte showed them out with a politeness that she was aware had a particular quality to it. The politeness of a woman who knew she'd just been defended in a way she hadn't expected and was still figuring out what to do with that. She closed the door. She turned around to find Wyatt still standing in the hallway, one hand braced against the wall, in a way that suggested he'd been doing more leaning than the stillness of his expression had let on. "You should sit down," she said. "I'm aware." "Then why aren't you—" "I wanted to make sure you heard that," he said. She looked at him. "I heard it." "Good." He pushed off the wall with the careful coordination of a man whose head was unsteady and began walking toward the sitting room. "Let me know when dinner's ready." She watched him go. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still on the door latch, and something warm and complicated moving through her chest that she recognized from a distance as the feeling she got when something she had stopped expecting happened anyway. She went back to the kitchen. She had a ranch to run. What she hadn't anticipated was Dale, not Dale specifically, but the thing Dale represented, which was the ranch hand who decided that a woman's authority in the kitchen did not necessarily extend to the places where he had always done things his own way. It happened on the 6th evening, when she went out to the supply shed to check the feed inventory she'd been trying to organize and found it in a state that was not the state she'd left it in. Someone had rearranged the bins, consolidating in a way that made the daily access harder and the weekly accounting impossible, and they'd done it in a way that was thorough enough to be intentional. She asked Hector quietly, who'd been in the supply shed. Hector looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Dale's in charge of supply runs," he said. She went and found Dale in the barn. "Mr. Dale," she said. She'd noticed that he responded better to the formal address. It engaged some vestigial politeness that direct conversation sometimes bypassed. He looked up from what he was doing. Something in his face settled into the studied neutrality of a man getting ready to defend a position. "The supply shed," she said. "I had it organized a certain way for a reason. The daily feed needs to be accessible without moving the larger inventory. The weekly accounting requires the bins to be in the order I had them. I know how to run a supply shed," he said. "I don't doubt it. But the method I've set up serves the whole household, not just the feed schedule, and I need it kept the way I've arranged it. With respect, ma'am, the supply shed's always been the hand's responsibility. And the accounts are part of my responsibility," she said. "And the way the shed is organized right now, I can't run the accounts accurately." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to change how you do your work, Mr. Dale. I'm asking you to change where you put things. That's a smaller ask than it might feel like." He stared at her. "I'll have it back the way you want it by morning," he said finally in the voice of a man making a concession he intends to remember. "Thank you," Charlotte said. "The biscuits will be fresh at breakfast." She walked back to the house. Stick, who had apparently witnessed the exchange from somewhere she hadn't noticed, caught up with her halfway across the yard. "Did you just bribe him with biscuits?" he said. "I acknowledged that he did me a favor and offered something of value in return," she said. "That's not a bribe. That's an economy." Stick thought about this. "He's gonna do it again, you know. Try something like that. He doesn't like—" He stopped. "Being managed by someone who looks like me," Charlotte said. "I was gonna say being managed by someone new." "Were you?" she said. He had the grace to look sideways. "Maybe not entirely." "I know," she said. "It's all right. People usually come around when they see the work." She went inside. She thought about what Wyatt had said to Greta Webb. "She pulled me out of a blizzard in which I would have died. Not a local woman happened to find me. Not fortunately someone came along." He had been specific. He had given her credit in front of people who were looking for reasons not to. She hadn't expected that. She was still quietly figuring out what to do with it. On the 8th day, Wyatt walked into the kitchen at 6 in the morning and asked her to teach him how she was doing the accounts. She looked at him across the table. "Why, because if you ever left," he said, "I'd be back where I started, except worse, because now I'd know how it was supposed to look." He sat down. "And because I'd like to understand what's happening on my own ranch." She looked at him for a moment. Then she got up, got the account books, and set them on the table between them. They worked for 2 hours. He was a quick study, which she hadn't quite expected, and then had because the order of his fences and the precision of his animal records suggested a man who was capable of systematic thinking. He'd just never had anyone show him how to apply it to figures. He made an error on the 3rd column, and she corrected it without comment, just a slight redirection of his hand toward the right line. He looked at the correction, looked at her, and said, "You could have let me feel it." "You'd have found it in 10 minutes, she said. "I saved us 10 minutes. Or you could have let me find it myself and felt the satisfaction." She looked at him. There was something in his voice that was almost playful, which was new. She had not quite budgeted for playful. "There are 2 more columns after this one," she said. "You'll have plenty of opportunity to feel the satisfaction." His mouth curved, just slightly. Just enough to change the whole character of his face for a moment. The severity of it softened into something that was unexpectedly, she was going to say younger, but that wasn't quite it. Lighter. He looked lighter for a moment, the way someone looks when they've put something down that they've been carrying so long they forgot it wasn't attached to them. She looked back at the account books. Outside the ranch was coming alive around them, the sounds of the hands in the yard. The particular cold morning quiet of a Montana winter that was its own kind of music. The fire was going well. The coffee was hot. Charlotte Bennett sat across from Wyatt Callahan in his kitchen in the house that still held the shape of someone else's love and someone else's careful order, and she thought that she had not felt this, whatever this was, this sense of being correctly placed in a space in a very long time. She turned to the next column. "All right," she said. "This one's trickier. Pay attention." The accounts were only the beginning. By the end of the 2nd week, Charlotte had reorganized the cellar inventory, renegotiated the standing order with the dry goods supplier in town, cutting the monthly cost by nearly a third. Simply by consolidating the purchase schedule, and identified a slow leak in the water line to the main barn that had been bleeding heat and money all winter without anyone noticing. Hector had noticed her noticing, and had said nothing, which was by this point his highest form of praise. Wyatt noticed too. She could feel him noticing, not in the way of a man cataloging a woman, but in the way of someone watching a thing he'd been told was one kind of object reveal itself to be something entirely different. He didn't say much about it. He was not a man who said much about most things. But he started appearing in the kitchen at times that weren't meal times, with questions that were partly about the ranch and partly, she suspected, just questions. He asked her about the homestead she'd grown up on. He asked her about Great Falls, about Mrs. Halverson, about the 5 years she'd spent there, and what had ended them. He asked in the careful, indirect way of a man who was curious and had decided that being honest about his curiosity was more respectful than pretending he wasn't. She answered in the same way she did everything directly, without embellishment, without inviting more than she was ready to give. She told him about her father, who had worked himself into an early grave by the time she was 19, and left her with 4 younger siblings, a depleted homestead, and a skill set that was worth considerably more in the world than the world was generally prepared to acknowledge. She told him about the 2 years she'd spent holding that homestead together before her youngest brother was old enough to take on the work, and how she'd handed it over and walked out with nothing but her letter from Mrs. Halverson, and the knowledge that she was by any reasonable measure capable of more than she'd been given credit for. She did not tell him about the other things. The particular loneliness of being 24 years old and understanding exactly what you were worth while watching the world consistently assign you a lower value. The way she'd gotten used to men looking at her and finding the sum of her less than its parts. The careful fence she'd built post by post to keep that particular cold on the outside. Those were her things, not his. Not yet. What she told him was enough. She could see to do something to the way he looked at her. Not pity. She wouldn't have stood for pity, but something closer to the expression of a man revising a map he'd been using incorrectly. She told herself that was fine. She told herself it didn't matter the way he looked at her. She was here for the work. She was becoming incrementally and against her better judgment, not entirely sure that was true. The trouble with Dale escalated on a Tuesday, not dramatically. Nothing with Dale was ever quite dramatic. He was too cagey for that. It was the kind of escalation that happened around the edges, small enough to deny if you needed to, large enough to make a point. She came out to the supply shed on a Tuesday morning to find her new organization system had been partially undone again. Not entirely, just enough of it. Just enough that she couldn't tell from the outside whether it was deliberate or careless. She stood in the doorway of that shed and breathed for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen and made breakfast, and when Dale came in, she put his plate in front of him and said very quietly, "Last time." He looked up. "That's the last time," she said. "If it happens again, I'll bring it to Mr. Callahan. Not because I need him to fight my battles, but because it becomes his problem when it affects the accounts, and it will affect the accounts." She held his gaze. "I don't want to do that. I'd rather we sorted this between ourselves. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to pretend I don't see what's happening." Dale stared at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face, not quite embarrassment, but something in that territory. "The shed's always been run the Hands way," he said. "But it was quieter this time, less certain. And now it's run the household's way," she said. "That's not a demotion. It's just a change. You're still in charge of the supply runs. That doesn't change." Stick from the other end of the table was staring at his plate with the concentrated attention of a man pretending not to be fascinated by what he was witnessing. Amos said without looking up, "Good eggs." Charlotte sat down. "Thank you, Amos." The shed was not touched again. "Dad, It was Rupert who told her 2 days later about Wallace Greer. He did it sideways in the way of a man who was not sure he should be telling her at all, but had decided the alternative was worse. He caught her on the way back from the barn in the late afternoon, when the cold had softened slightly toward evening, and the light was doing something almost kind with the snow. And he fell into step beside her with the studied casualness of someone who had rehearsed an opening. "You know about Greer," he said. "I know the name," she said. "The largest ranch in the valley northeast of Red Creek. A man named Wallace Greer, who had, as far as she could tell from what she'd gathered in 2 weeks of listening carefully, a significant amount of money and an appetite for more of everything." "What about him?" "He's been trying to buy the Callahan spread for about 2 years, Rupert said. "Every time something goes wrong out here, bad season equipment breaks. The boss had that bad fall last spring. Greer shows up with an offer. Little lower each time." He paused. "The boss always says no." "I see," Charlotte said. "Greer's also." Rupert stopped, started again. "He's not a man who takes no well. He's connected, knows people in Billings. The kind of people who can make things difficult if they want to." He glanced at her. "He came into the supply store in town yesterday. Hector was there. He was talking about you." Charlotte slowed slightly. "What was he saying?" "That it was interesting," Rupert said, "that Callahan hired someone so quick after his accident. That a single woman living on a man's ranch was, he used the word, irregular. And that he wondered if the good people of Red Creek might want to be concerned about what kind of operation Callahan was running out here." The words landed flat and cold. She had heard versions of this before. Different words, same architecture. The kind of thing that didn't require any particular fact to do its damage. Just the suggestion, just the insinuation planted in enough ears and left to grow in whatever soil it found. "Did Hector say anything?" she said. "Hector told him he was a fool and left," Rupert said. "But that's not the thing, as Miss Bennett Greer's got friends in town. He supplies a lot of businesses. People owe him things. And he's been looking for leverage on the boss for 2 years." He paused. "You need to know that you're being used as leverage." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "The boss should know." "Yes," she said. "He should." She told Wyatt that evening. She told him plainly the way she always told him things sitting at the kitchen table after the hands had eaten and the house had gone quiet. The plainness that she'd learned was the only way she could hold a conversation about herself without it costing her something she didn't want to spend. He listened. His face went through several things while she talked, none of them comfortable. "Greer?" he said when she'd finished. "You know him. I know him." The evenness of his voice was doing a lot of work. "He's been after this land since my father-in-law sold the parcel to the east. He thinks the Callahan spread would double the value of his operation if he could add it to his. And he's a man who—" He stopped. "He's a man who believes that if he can't buy something, he finds another way to get it." "And I'm the other way," Charlotte said. "You're the tool he's trying to use," Wyatt said. "That's different." "Is it?" She looked at him. Not challengingly. Just directly in the way she always looked at things she needed to understand. "Because from where I'm standing, what he's doing is what people do to women who step outside of where they're supposed to be. He didn't invent it. He's just using something that was already there." Wyatt was quiet. "If you need me to find other arrangements," she said, "I can understand that. If this is causing damage to the ranch's reputation or to your position in town. Charlotte." He said her name the same way he had in front of Greta Webb, flat and certain with no room in it for the sentence she was building. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to let me handle Greer." "I don't need you to handle Greer," he said again quietly. "That part's mine. You've handled enough." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with an expression that was difficult to categorize and that she was fairly sure she shouldn't spend too much time examining. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She got up and started clearing the table because she needed something to do with her hands. He went to town the next morning. He didn't tell her exactly what he intended to do. He told Hector in a low conversation in the yard that Charlotte observed from the kitchen window while pretending to count the preserving jars. And then he saddled his own horse for the first time since the accident. She watched that too from a different angle, with the specific attention of someone monitoring whether a man was physically ready for the thing he was insisting on doing, and rode out before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. He came back 3 hours later. She was in the main room reorganizing the bookshelves when she heard him come in. She didn't go to the hallway. She waited. He appeared in the doorway of the main room. "Well?" she said without turning around. "I had a conversation with Frank Aldridge," he said. Aldridge was the owner of the Red Creek supply store, the closest thing the town had to a neutral broker of social reality. "And with Pastor Grimes. And I stopped in at the boarding house and spoke with Mrs. Pruitt." Charlotte stopped reorganizing. "Mrs. Pruitt? Who informed me?" Wyatt said with something in his voice that was new, something dry and carefully controlled. "That she has known Wallace Greer for 15 years and has never once trusted him as far as she could throw him, and that if people in this town had any sense, they'd reserve their concern for what Greer was doing rather than what he was saying about other people." He paused. "She also said she remembered you from when you stayed there. She said, and I'm quoting here, that you were the tidiest guest she'd ever had, and that you made your bed every morning before breakfast, which she considered a sign of genuine character." Charlotte turned around. She looked at him. Something in his face was working the severe lines of it, doing something complicated around the eyes and the mouth that she was beginning to learn was what it looked like when Wyatt Callahan felt something he wasn't sure how to carry. "You went around town defending me," she said. "I went around town stating facts," he said. "The facts happen to be in your favor." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, because she needed to know why. He looked back at her. "Because it was the right thing to do." "That's not—" She stopped. "That's not all of it." He was quiet for a moment. The fire was going in the hearth. Outside, she could hear Stick's voice somewhere in the yard calling something to Rupert that she couldn't make out. "No," he said finally. "It's not all of it." She waited. "Because you came off that road," he said, "in a blizzard, for a man who'd turned you away from his door. And you didn't do it because you expected anything from it. You did it because that's who you are." He stopped. Started again. "I've been running this ranch for 8 years. I have a sense for what lasts and what doesn't. What holds up when things get hard." He held her gaze. "You hold up, Charlotte. I've watched you do it every day for 2 weeks. It'd be a particular kind of wrong to let someone like Greer use that against you." The silence was long enough to hear the fire and the wind and the particular quality of quiet that comes after something true has been said. "All right," Charlotte said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "I still owe you considerably more than a good word at the supply store." She turned back to the bookshelf. She needed to turn back to the bookshelf. "I'm putting the agricultural references on the bottom 2 shelves," she said. "The almanac should be accessible without a ladder. Is that all right?" She could hear without seeing it the slight shift in his breathing that meant he was doing that almost smile again. "That's fine," he said. "I'll be in the office." He left. Charlotte stood in front of the bookshelf and held onto a copy of the 1875 Farmer's Almanac with both hands and breathed. "You hold up, Charlotte." She had been told many things about herself over 24 years. She had been told she was too much and not enough too large, and not enough of the right things, stubborn and difficult, and better suited for work than for anything softer. She had built her fence against most of it. She had not, she realized, built any fence against that particular sentence. She shelved the almanac and moved on to the next book. The first real test came on a Friday. Not from Greer, not from town. It came from the weather, which in Montana Territory, in the winter of 1878, was a more reliable antagonist than any person. A cold snap had been building for 3 days, the kind that came down from Canada and settled into the bones of the land with a personal feeling malice. And on Friday morning, Wyatt came into the kitchen before dawn with the particular expression of a man who has looked at the sky and made a calculation he doesn't like. "Temperature's going to drop another 20 degrees by noon," he said. "Maybe more." "I know," Charlotte said. She had felt it in the draft off the kitchen window when she'd gotten up at 4. "The animals?" "That's the concern. We've got 6 calves that came early they shouldn't have, but we had a bull get out in October." He stopped. "They can't stay in the regular barn. It's not going to hold enough heat." "The room off the south side of the main barn?" Charlotte said. "I looked in there last week. It's smaller. It holds heat better. You'd need to move the tack out, but—" "It'd work," he said, nodding slightly. "Yeah, it'd work." He looked at her. "How'd you know about that room?" "I looked in it," she said. "I look in all the rooms. It's how I know what I'm working with." He went to the door. Stopped. "I'll need everyone on this. Even you if you're willing." "Of course I'm willing," she said. "Tell me where you need me." What followed was 6 hours of the hardest collective work she'd done since she'd left her family's homestead, 6 hours of moving tack and clearing space, and coaxing frightened, cold calves from one location to another, with hands that went numb inside her gloves, and a back that staged a quiet protest she didn't have the time to acknowledge. She worked beside Hector, beside Stick, beside Amos, beside Rupert. She worked beside Wyatt, who moved with the economical sureness of a man who knew every inch of his own operation, and who she noticed kept her in his peripheral vision the entire time, not hovering, not managing her, just aware of where she was. The way you stayed aware of something you decided you weren't going to lose track of. By midday, all 6 calves were in the south room, with enough hay and warmth to get through the cold snap. The hands went in for lunch. Charlotte went after them last out of the barn and found Wyatt waiting by the door. He looked at her. She was covered in hay and mud and less well-preserved than she'd been at the start of the morning. She suspected she looked exactly as exhausted as she felt. "You're something else," he said, quietly. Not to the table, not to Hector. To her. It was what Hector had said in the kitchen on the first morning, but it landed differently when Wyatt said it. Everything landed differently when Wyatt said it, which was something she was going to need to think about at a time when she had more resources available for thinking. "Hungry," she said. "I'm something that's very hungry." His mouth curved. "Come on, then." The twist came 12 days in, and Charlotte did not see it coming. She should have. She had the information, she had the pieces. But she had been focused on the work and on the accounts and on Wyatt, and on not thinking too directly about Wyatt, and she had missed the shape of what was building. It started with a letter. Hector brought it in from town on a Wednesday, tucked in with the supply order receipts, and left it on the desk in the front office without comment. It was addressed to Wyatt. She didn't read it. It wasn't hers to read, but she saw Wyatt's face when he came out of the office an hour later, and that was information enough. He had the closed, careful look of a man who had received news that he was processing privately. She said nothing. She went on with her work, but at dinner, she noticed he was quieter than usual. And after dinner, when the hands had gone, and the house had gone to its evening quiet, he came and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He didn't drink, and the look of a man who was going to say something and was still deciding how. "Greer's made a formal offer," he said. She looked up from the accounts. "For the ranch." "For the ranch." He wrapped his hands around the mug. "Through a lawyer in Billings. It's a proper offer. More than the last one." He paused. "Still less than it's worth, but closer." "Are you considering it?" she asked carefully. "No." The word was immediate and certain. "No. This land was my father's. My wife is buried on the East Ridge." He looked at the table. "I'm not considering it." "Then why does it trouble you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the letter didn't just make an offer," he said. "It also contained information about a lien on the property that I didn't know existed, Something from before my father's time. The lawyer in Billings says it's a valid claim, that there's a question about the original deed." He looked up at her. "If the claim holds, I could lose the ranch anyway. Not to Greer's offer, to the deed itself." Charlotte put down her pen. "The original deed," she said. "Is it here?" "Somewhere. My father kept everything but his system for keeping things. Was—" He made a gesture that described a chaos she had already partly encountered in the reorganization of the office. "The wooden crate," she said. "In the back of the office closet. I found it when I was reorganizing, but I didn't go through it because I thought it was personal." "Is that where it would be?" He stared at her. "Yes. Probably." She stood up. "What are you—" "Getting the crate," she said. "If there's a lien claim being made against the property, the first thing we need is the original deed and anything attached to it. Once we know what's actually there, we can figure out if the claim holds." "Charlotte, it's 9 o'clock at night." "The lien doesn't care what time it is," she said, already moving toward the office. He was behind her a moment later, and for the next hour they sat together on the floor of the office, with the wooden crate open between them, going through 30 years of her father-in-law's careful, chaotic paper trail. Charlotte organized as she went a thing she couldn't stop herself from doing, sorting by date, by type, by what was clearly relevant and what wasn't. Wyatt handed her papers, and she read them with the focused speed of someone who had been reading documents for years as part of household management, and who had learned that the important thing was always in the thing everyone else had glossed over. She found it at 45 minutes in. "Here," she said. He leaned over to look. It was a letter dated 1861 from the original Territorial Land Office. She read it once quickly, and then again slowly, and by the end of the second reading she was certain. "The lien was settled," she said. "In 1863, there's a release here signed by the land office and the creditor. The debt was paid." She looked at him. "Whoever sent that letter to Billings either didn't know about this or knew about it and was betting you didn't." The silence stretched. "Greer," Wyatt said, quietly, with a flatness that was much more dangerous than anger would have been. "I don't know that," Charlotte said. "I only know that the claim in that letter is not valid. You'd need a lawyer to confirm it, but—" She held out the release document. "This is clear enough." He took the paper. He read it. He sat back on his heels and looked at the ceiling for a long moment with the expression of a man who has been handed back something he thought he'd lost. "You found this," he said. "It was in the crate. In 45 minutes. In a crate that I've had for 3 years and never thought to go through." "You had other things to manage," she said. "Charlotte." He looked at her. The firelight from the hallway was the only light in the office, and it did something to the severity of his face, softened it, or maybe revealed something underneath the severity that was already soft. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. Started again. "I've had this ranch for 8 years. I've run it alone for 3, and in 2 weeks you have—" He shook his head. "There is no version of fair compensation for what you've done here. You're paying me a fair wage," she said. "That's not—" "And you gave me a room without a draft," she said. "Once we sort the window." Something cracked in his expression. Not broke, cracked the way ice cracks before it gives, and the thing underneath it is water after all. "Charlotte," he said. She was aware of how close they were sitting on the floor of the office, with 30 years of documents between them and the firelight from the hall catching the color of his eyes. She was aware of it, the way you're aware of the edge of something, not in danger of it, exactly, but knowing it was there. "It's late," she said. "You need to write to the lawyer in Billings first thing in the morning. Send him the release document. He'll need to file a response to whatever Greer's people sent." "Yes," he said, not moving. "I'll help you draft the letter if you want." "Yes," he said again. "In the morning," she said, "when we can see properly." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded, and they both started getting up, and the particular quality of the moment passed the way moments do not gone, but changed, absorbed into the ordinary movement of 2 people standing up and collecting papers in a dimly lit room. She went to her room. She lay on her cot and looked at the ceiling and listened to the wind outside the window that still had its draft and thought about the look on his face when she'd handed him the release document. The way the careful flatness of him had cracked for a moment and shown her something underneath it that was raw and uncertain and human in a way that the surface of him wasn't. She had not come here for this. She had come here for work, for a wage and a room and a chance to do the thing she was good at in a place that needed doing. She told herself that clearly. She had always been good at telling herself things clearly. She was less good lying there in the dark at the part where she believed it. She was up at 4:30 as usual. The letter to Billings was drafted before 6. Wyatt read it, made 2 changes, and signed it with a clean deliberateness that told her he'd slept on it and arrived somewhere settled. "I want to show you something," he said after Hector had taken the letter for the Morning Post. She looked at him. He got his coat. She got hers. He took her to the East Ridge. She had not been there before. It was a rise of ground above the ranch house, not high, but high enough to see the whole of the valley, the white sweep of the land, the dark line of the tree line, the distant suggestion of Red Creek's buildings against the gray morning sky. It was early enough that the sun was just coming over the far range, and it caught the snow in a way that made it look less like a burden and more like something the land was wearing on purpose. There was a headstone, simple gray stone. Margaret Elaine Callahan, 1843 to 1875. Beloved. Charlotte stood beside it. Wyatt stood beside her. "I haven't brought anyone here," he said. "Since she died." She said nothing. "I don't know why I brought you," he said. But the way he said it suggested that he did know, and that the knowing was what he was working through. She looked at the headstone, and then at the valley, and then at him. He was looking at the valley too, with the expression of a man who had come to a place many times alone, and was figuring out what it meant to not be alone in it. "She sounds like she was someone worth knowing," Charlotte said finally. "She was," he said. "She wasn't easy either. She had opinions about things, and she didn't soften them for politeness, and she drove me half out of my mind sometimes." He paused. "I respected her more than almost anyone I ever knew." "What would she think?" Charlotte said. "About me?" The question surprised him. She could see at the slight shift of his weight, the quick glance at her. "What do you mean?" "About the house," she said. "About the way I've stepped into what she built." He was quiet for a long moment. "She'd have tested you," he said finally. "She tested everyone, made them work for her trust. And then when you had it..." He stopped. "She'd have liked you. I think she'd have liked you a great deal." He looked at the headstone. She couldn't abide anyone who flinched from hard things. "I'll take that," Charlotte said. They stood there a moment longer. The sun was fully up now, and the valley was fully lit, and the Callahan ranch below them was showing its first signs of the day. Stick crossing the yard smoke coming from the bunkhouse, Hector's distinctive silhouette at the barn door. "We should go down," Charlotte said. "In a minute," Wyatt said. She stayed. They stood there together in the cold morning light above the ranch that someone had loved and built and left behind, and Charlotte thought about the walls she'd built and the things she hadn't let through them, and the particular danger of standing on a ridge with a man who looked at her like she was something worth looking at, and who had driven 40 minutes into a headwind to tell Mrs. Pruitt that she was good and honest and real. "Wyatt," she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name. She hadn't planned it. It came out the way things came out when your fence had a gap in it you hadn't known about. He turned and looked at her. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't be kind to me like that unless you mean it. I'm not..." She stopped. Found the sentence. "I'm not built for kindness that doesn't hold." He looked at her for a long time. The wind moved between them. "Charlotte," he said. And the way he said it, steady, deliberate, with no softening and no retreat, told her something that she was going to need time to examine in a place with better light and more distance. "I mean everything I do," he said. "That's always been my problem." She looked at him. She turned back to the valley. "We should get back," she said. "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved for another full minute. Then they went down together into the morning, into the work, into the ordinary bright difficulty of what was being built between them slowly without ceremony, the way the most permanent things always were. Below them, the ranch was waking up. And Wallace Greer's name, sitting in both their minds like an ember that hadn't gone out yet, was about to become considerably more than a problem on paper. The letter to Billings went out on Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Red Creek knew about it. Charlotte didn't know how these things traveled so fast in a town this size, whether it was the postmaster, or someone who'd seen Hector at the supply store, or simply the particular osmosis of small communities where information moved through walls. But by the time she walked into the dry goods store on Friday to update the standing order, she could feel the shift in the room the moment she stepped through the door. Two women near the fabric bolts went quiet in a way that was louder than talking. The man behind the counter, a thin, careful person named Mr. Elias, who had always been politely neutral toward her, gave her a look that had something new and assessing in it. She placed her order. She was pleasant. She did not acknowledge the quiet. On her way out, she nearly walked into Wallace Greer. She had not met him before. She knew him the moment she saw him the way you know certain kinds of men, not from what they look like, but from the particular way they occupy space, as if the space owes them something. He was heavy-set and well-dressed, for Red Creek silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and now wore its age like a position of authority. He held the door as if he'd planned to be there. "Miss Bennett," he said. She stopped. "Mr. Greer," he smiled. It was a perfectly calibrated smile, warm enough to be social, precise enough to let her know he knew exactly who she was, and had thought about this moment. "I've been hoping for the opportunity to introduce myself. I've heard a great deal about you." "I imagine you have," she said. "Remarkable story," he said. "Finding Callahan in that snow. Most people would have walked on by." "Most people," she agreed. She kept her voice even. She kept her face pleasant. She had been in rooms with men like Greer before, men who dressed their intentions in civility and expected you to be grateful for the gift wrap. "I understand you've been a tremendous help to the Callahan operation," he said. "Reorganizing things, the accounts I hear, finding old documents." He let that sit for precisely the right beat. "Industrious." "I do my job," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "You know, I've always had a great deal of respect for women who work hard. My late wife was a very capable woman. I often think that capable women are underutilized in this territory." He paused. "I wonder if you've considered that your considerable abilities might be better placed somewhere with more stability, more security. The Callahan spread is a fine operation, but it's carrying some uncertainty right now. I'd hate to see someone in your position caught up in difficulties." She looked at him directly. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Greer?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite what he'd expected. "I'm simply observing. Because if you're offering me a job, I'd want to know the terms," she said pleasantly. "And if you're suggesting that I should be concerned about the stability of my current position, I'd want to know what information you have that would make that a reasonable suggestion." She held his gaze. "And if you're doing neither of those things, and this is simply a conversation, then I'd say it's been a pleasure and good day to you, sir." She walked past him. Her hands were shaking inside her gloves, and she was not going to look back, and she made it 30 yards down the street before she let herself take a full breath. He had just told her without saying a single specific thing that the pressure wasn't done, that finding the deed release hadn't closed anything, that he was still moving. She went back to the ranch. Wyatt could read her face by now. She hadn't given him permission to, but he'd done it anyway, the way you learn someone when you share a space with them closely enough. Reading the set of her shoulders, the particular quality of her silence, the way she moved when something had happened, versus the way she moved when the world was simply doing its ordinary work. He came and found her in the kitchen before she had to go to him. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it, every word as precisely as she remembered, which was very precisely. He listened without interrupting, standing in the kitchen doorway, with his arms crossed and an expression that was getting progressively quieter in the way that meant his temper was going somewhere internal rather than external. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "He offered you a job," he said. "He implied one," she said, wrapped in a question. "He's a man who understands deniability." "Yes," Wyatt's voice was flat. "He is." "He's not done with the deed claim," she said. "I don't know what he has next, but he's not done." Wyatt walked to the window, stood there for a moment looking out, though she suspected he wasn't seeing anything outside. "I want you to know," he said, not turning around, "that whatever he has next, it doesn't change anything on my end. Your position here isn't dependent on the legal situation with the property, however that resolves." "I know that," she said. "I want it said plainly." "I appreciate it." She paused. "But Wyatt, what does he have? If the deed claim is invalid, what's the next move for a man like him?" He turned around. The expression on his face had changed, moved past whatever he'd been working through at the window into something more focused and considerably less comfortable. "There's a water rights dispute," he said. "From 4 years ago. I settled it, I thought, with a handshake agreement with old Pete Hanley on the northern property. But Hanley died last spring and his son inherited, and his son has different ideas, and—" He stopped. "Greer's been in business with Hanley's son since September. I just found that out last week." Charlotte sat down. "Water rights," she said. "If Hanley's son files a formal dispute, and Greer backs it financially, legally, and it goes to a territorial court, it could tie up this ranch's operating status for a year, maybe 2. He sat down across from her. "I can't run a cattle operation under those conditions, not with the size of the herd I'm carrying." "Can you settle it before he files?" "I'd need to get to Hanley's son before Greer does, and Greer's had a 4-month head start." He looked at the table. "His son's name is Peter Hanley Jr. He's 22. He doesn't know this territory, and he doesn't know ranching, and Greer has been buying him very good meals in Billings for 4 months. "Does he need money?" Charlotte said. Wyatt looked up. "Peter Jr.," she said. "Does he need money?" "Because his father left him a property he doesn't know how to run in territory. He doesn't know, and he's been letting a man with deep pockets feed him expensive meals. That usually means someone who's uncertain and looking for a solution that doesn't require him to be competent." She looked at Wyatt. "If you could offer him a straightforward purchase of the water rights, clean, fair, a price he's happy with before Greer makes him an alternative offer." "I don't have Greer's liquidity," Wyatt said. "What do you have?" He named a figure. She thought about it. "The quarterly cattle revenue comes in when?" she said. "End of February. That's 6 weeks." She pulled the account books toward her. "If I reduce the supply order for the next 3 weeks, defer the barn repair until spring, and you advance 1 month on the feed contract, I can put together something close to what you'd need for a fair offer." She looked at him. "I'd need a day with the books." He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she'd seen on the ridge, the one she hadn't built adequate fence against. "You'd restructure my accounts for this," he said. "It's my job to make the accounts work," she said. "That's what I do." "Charlotte." "Don't," she said quietly. "Let me work. The other conversation can happen later. Let me work." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Work." He got up and left her to it. She worked through dinner. Hector brought her a plate and set it beside her without comment, which she'd come to recognize as his version of deep affection. The hands ate without her, and she could hear them through the kitchen wall, the low rumble of their voices, and Stick's occasional laugh, and the ordinary sounds of the household she'd spent 3 weeks learning to run, settled around her like something familiar and solid. By 9 o'clock she had it. It was tighter than she'd have liked, and it required the beef contract payment to come in on schedule, which was not guaranteed, but it held. She wrote the figures out cleanly, added her notes in the margin, and left the open book on the kitchen table for Wyatt. Then she went to the back step and stood in the cold for a moment because she needed air. It was a clear night. The kind of Montana winter night that was genuinely beautiful, if you could get past the cold of it, hard-starred with a moon that made the snow glow in a way that looked invented. She stood on the back step and looked at it and thought about what she'd said to him. Let me work. The other conversation can happen later. She had been avoiding the other conversation for 3 weeks. She was good at avoiding it. She had a lot of practice avoiding conversations about what she felt, because what she felt had historically not been something the world was particularly interested in accommodating. But Wyatt was not the world. She had been trying very hard not to think about that too clearly. She went back inside. He found the account notes in the morning. She was at the stove when she heard him come in, heard the specific silence that meant he was looking at something, and then heard his step cross to the table and the sound of the book being picked up. She didn't turn around. The silence lasted 4 minutes. She counted. "This works," he said. "Yes." "You've been awake since 4. I'm always awake since 4. You were awake before 4 last night." She turned around then, because there was something in his voice that required facing. He was standing at the kitchen table, with the account book in one hand, looking at her with an expression that had nothing to do with figures. "Wyatt," she said. "I need to go to Billings," he said, "to meet with Peter Hanley Jr. before Greer gets to him with whatever he's planning next. I'll be gone 2 days, maybe 3. He paused. "I'd like you to run the ranch while I'm gone." She looked at him. "You have a foreman?" "I have Hector, who is excellent and has been here longer than anyone, and whom I trust completely," Wyatt said. "And I have you, who has been here 3 weeks and has already found a fraudulent deed, claim reorganized my supply costs, kept my household running, and reconstructed my accounts well enough to fund a land negotiation." He set the book down. "I want Hector on operations. I want you on everything else. I'll tell the men before I leave." "They might not like it," she said. "Dale might not like it," he said. "The others are already yours." Something turned over in her chest. "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate one," he said. "Stick asked me yesterday if we were going to keep you permanent. Amos told Hector you make the best biscuits he's ever had, and Amos doesn't say that about anything. Rupert asked me this morning if I was going to be an idiot about it." She stared at him. "Rupert said that. Rupert is more direct than he looks." He held her gaze. "I told him I was working on not being an idiot about it." The kitchen was very quiet. "You should leave early," Charlotte said. "If you're going to Billings, the roads will be better in the morning cold than by afternoon." "Charlotte, take Hector's good horse," she said. "Yours is still favoring the left foreleg from the fall. I noticed it yesterday when Stick was exercising him." "I noticed it too," he said quietly. "Of course you did." She turned back to the stove. "I'll have something ready for the road. Give me 20 minutes. He didn't move for a moment. She could feel him standing there, that awareness she'd developed of exactly where he was in any given room, the particular warmth of his presence that she'd given up pretending she didn't notice. "The other conversation," he said. She kept her hands on the stove. "When you get back." "Is that a promise?" She glanced back at him, just briefly. "That's a promise." He left to saddle up. She stood at the stove and breathed in and breathed out and told herself she was fine, which was not entirely true, but was close enough to functional to get through the next 20 minutes. With Wyatt gone, the ranch recalibrated around her. It happened more naturally than she'd expected. Hector ran the outdoor operations with the efficient certainty of a man who'd been doing it for 11 years and needed no supervision. Dale, who had apparently decided during the course of the past 3 weeks that his resistance was costing him more than it was worth, worked without complaint, and even once asked her opinion on the feed schedule adjustment she'd proposed. She gave it. He implemented it. They did not discuss this as a development which suited them both. Stick followed her around at intervals, asking questions that ranged from practical to genuinely curious. He asked her where she'd grown up and how she'd learned accounts, and whether she thought it was possible to teach yourself to read music from a book. She answered all of these with equal seriousness, which seemed to mean something to him. Rupert said on the second day, "He's going to ask you to stay permanently." She was mending a harness. "I'm already here permanently," I have a contract. That's not what I mean, Rupert said. I know what you mean, she said. And it's none of your business, Rupert. He grinned. Yes, ma'am. Amos on the third day appeared at the kitchen door with a length of good quality caulking material and without explanation began addressing the draft situation in her window. She watched him work for a moment and then asked if he'd done this before. Every winter, he said. Did anyone ask you to do it? No, he said. She looked at the back of his head. Thank you, Amos. He finished the window and left without another word. She stood in her room afterward, in the stillness that had replaced the draft, and thought about what it meant to be in a place where people did things for you without being asked. It had not happened to her often enough that she took it easily. Wyatt came back on the third evening. She heard the horse in the yard and went to the kitchen window, not to watch. She told herself not to watch, but she ended up watching anyway. He dismounted in the yard with the slightly stiffened movement of a man who'd been in the saddle most of the day, and she saw him exchange a few words with Stick, who'd come to take the horse, and then he looked up at the house. He looked directly at the kitchen window. She stepped back, then felt foolish for stepping back. She was 36 inches from the window, and he was in a dark yard. He couldn't have actually seen her. But something in the angle of his head suggested he knew she was there. She went to the stove and had coffee on by the time he came through the door. Hanley, she said without turning around. Done, he said. He came in and sat down, and she could hear the exhaustion in that one word. Signed, notarized. I got there 6 hours ahead of Greer's representative, who arrived at Peter Jr.'s hotel in Billings just as we were finishing up. She heard a short, rough sound that was almost a laugh. The look on his face. She turned around and set the coffee in front of him. The price. He named it. It was what she'd calculated nearly to the dollar. That'll hold through the February payment, she said. Just barely. He wrapped his hands around the mug. He looked tired in the deep way of someone who'd run hard and finished something. It's done, though. Greer has no more angles on this property. The deed claim is invalid, the water rights are purchased, and the land is clean. He looked up at her. Because you found the release document and built the figures that made the purchase possible. She sat down across from him. You're the one who drove to Billings. In 6 hours, he said, you gave me something to drive to Billings with. He looked at her. Charlotte, I need you to understand that this ranch exists right now because of what you did. She was quiet. You said that the other conversation could happen when I got back, he said. I did, she said. I'm back. The kitchen was warm. The fire was going. Outside the ranch was quiet in the settled way of an evening after a hard few days, Hector's lamp on in the bunkhouse, the occasional sound of movement from the animals in the barn, the particular silence that settled over a working property when the work was done. I need to tell you something first, she said. All right. I didn't come to this ranch for anything other than work, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever's happened, whatever this is, I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't trying to... She stopped, found the sentence. I have spent my entire life being looked at and found insufficient. Not by everyone, but by enough people enough times that I built something around myself to manage it. And I need you to understand that, because I need you to understand what it costs me to let that down even slightly. She looked at him. I'm not telling you this to make you feel something. I'm telling you because I told you I don't work on assumptions, and I think this is the kind of situation where that applies more than most. He looked at her for a long time. Your fence, he said quietly. She blinked. You talked about it once, he said. Not directly, but I heard it. He set down his coffee. Charlotte, I'm going to tell you what I see, and you can decide what to do with it. Is that all right? She nodded once. I see a woman who walked onto my porch in a blizzard looking for work and had the guts to tell me plainly that I was wrong, he said. I see someone who came back off a road to help a man who'd already told her no, and who didn't do it for any reason except that it was the right thing to do. I see someone who walked into this house and understood it better in 2 weeks than I had in 3 years, who found a fraudulent legal claim in 45 minutes, who rebuilt my accounts so I could save my own property, who has never once, not once, asked for anything more than what she was owed. He paused. And I see a woman who laughs exactly once when Stick says something accidentally funny and then pretends she didn't, and who gives Amos real answers when he asks things, and who takes her coffee without anything in it, which Maggie always said was the mark of someone who... He stopped. Who what? Charlotte said. Who doesn't need things to be softer than they are, he said. She looked at him. There was a specific pain in this, not the bad kind exactly, but the kind that came from something being true that you hadn't let yourself believe was true. Wyatt, she said. She looked down at the table. I am not what most people expect. I know that. I know what I look like, and I know what you look like, he said quietly and completely. Charlotte, I know exactly what you look like. I looked at you the day you stood on my porch, and I saw a woman in a faded blue dress with mud on her boots, and a letter from an honest woman who said you were the finest she'd ever employed, and I made a choice I'm ashamed of. He leaned forward slightly. Let me be clear. I don't care what the women in town think. I don't care what Greer says. I don't care what Dale thought 3 weeks ago or what Mrs. Webb implied in my hallway. I care about who you are, which I have had 3 weeks to observe at close range, and what I have observed is someone He stopped, set his jaw. Someone I do not want to lose. From this house. From this table. He looked at her. From my life. The fire popped. The lamp moved slightly in a draft. Charlotte sat with her hands flat on the table and felt the specific sensation of something she'd built for a long time coming up against something it couldn't hold. That's a significant thing to say, she said. I know that. I need you to know that She stopped, started again. I feel something about you that I didn't account for and that I'd prefer to be practical about and can't quite manage to be. His mouth curved. That's the most Charlotte Bennett thing I've ever heard. She looked at him. Something in her cracked the way his face had cracked on the ridge, not broke cracked, and the thing underneath it surprised her with how warm it was. I'm not easy, she said. Neither am I, he said. As Rupert will confirm. I have opinions about things. So do I. They might not be the same opinions. They probably won't be, she said. About some things. Good, he said simply. I had enough of agreeing all by myself for 3 years. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then Dale put his head through the back door and said, Miss Bennett, sorry to interrupt, but we've got a problem with the south pen the gate latch gave and 3 calves are... Charlotte was on her feet before he finished the sentence. Which direction did they go? She said, already moving toward the back door. East toward the creek. She was past him and out the door. Behind her, she heard Wyatt's chair scrape back, heard him follow, heard the low sound of his voice directing Stick toward the east fence while she cut around the other side. They found all 3 calves in 20 minutes, muddy and outraged and entirely fine. Getting them back in required 4 people considerable patience and a specific kind of problem solving that involved Charlotte wading into a drift up to her hips to cut off the most determined one's escape route, which resulted in general chaos, and Stick losing his hat, and Rupert laughing hard enough to lose his balance, and everyone, including the calves, eventually arriving back at the south pen with the gate properly secured behind them. Charlotte stood in the yard afterward, catching her breath covered in mud and hay, with her hair half down from its pins, and found Wyatt standing 3 feet away, looking at her with an expression she recognized now. The one that did something to the severity of his face. The one she'd stopped building fence against. The other conversation, she said, breathing slightly hard. Can wait until you're not covered in calf mud, he said. It's the same conversation, she said. I'm still the same person. He looked at her, muddy, windblown, half-laughing still from the chaos of the past 20 minutes alive, in a way that the cold air and the work had brought to the surface of her. Yes, he said. You are. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back behind her ear. It was the smallest possible gesture. His hand barely touched her at all. She felt it everywhere. "Get inside," he said quietly. "You're going to freeze." "I've frozen before," she said. "Not on my watch," he said. She went inside. He followed. The kitchen was still warm. The coffee was still there. The account books were still on the corner of the table, where she always left them, and outside the ranch was settling into its nighttime quiet. And somewhere in the distance, a calf that had just experienced the most dramatic 20 minutes of its short life was making its opinion known to the others in the South Pen. Charlotte sat down. Wyatt sat down. Neither of them reached for the coffee. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what you're willing to accept. Not what you think is reasonable. What do you want?" She looked at him, and for once, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, she didn't reach for the practical version. "This," she said. "What this is already. I want it to be what it's been becoming." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what I want, too," he said. The lamp burned between them. The fire settled. Outside, the Montana winter was doing what it always did, implacable, enormous, indifferent. But inside the kitchen of the Callahan ranch, something that had been building for 3 weeks in the space between two people who didn't flinch from hard things was simply finally acknowledged. Not finished. Not resolved. Just named. And naming a thing Charlotte had always believed was where everything real began. The naming of a thing did not make it simple. Charlotte had known that going in. She had known it the same way she knew most true things, not from being told, but from living long enough to watch the space between what something was and what you hoped it would be. The conversation in the kitchen had been real. What Wyatt had said had been real. What she'd said back had been real. And then the morning came, the way mornings always did, and the ranch needed running, and the animals needed feeding. And Dale had a question about the supply order, and Stick had somehow managed to bend the good pitchfork in a way that defied easy explanation, and the world did not pause for the fact that two people in a kitchen had said something true to each other the night before. That was all right. Charlotte understood mornings. She understood that real things didn't need ceremony to stay real. What she hadn't counted on was Greta Webb coming back, not alone this time. She came on a Monday, 10 days after Wyatt's return from Billings, with 5 women instead of 2, and a particular quality of organized purpose that Charlotte recognized immediately as the kind that required an audience. They arrived mid-morning when the hands were out and Hector was in the far pasture, which Charlotte suspected was not an accident. She answered the door. Greta Webb looked at her with the expression of a woman who had spent the intervening weeks building to exactly this moment and intended to make it count. "Miss Bennett, is Mr. Callahan available?" "He's out on the property," Charlotte said. "Is there something I can help you with?" "We've come on behalf of the Ladies' Auxiliary," Greta said, with the gravity of someone invoking a power she considered absolute. "We have some concerns we'd like to raise directly with the household." Behind her, the 5 women arranged themselves with the practiced coordination of people who had discussed where they would stand. "Come in," Charlotte said. She showed them to the main room and offered coffee, which 3 of them accepted, and 2 declined in a way that was itself a statement. She went to get the coffee. She took 45 seconds to stand in the kitchen and be completely steady, and then she went back. She did not sit when she returned. She stood. This was a deliberate choice. She'd learned that the shape of a room changed depending on who was upright in it. Greta Webb held her coffee cup and did not drink from it. "Miss Bennett, I'll be direct." "Please," Charlotte said. "There are people in this town, a significant number of people, who have concerns about the nature of your arrangement here, about what it represents, about what message it sends." She paused. A young, unmarried woman living in the home of a widower, managing his finances, running his household. "Doing her job," Charlotte said pleasantly. "The impression it creates, Mrs. Webb." Charlotte's voice stayed even. She had built it to stay even. "I've heard the word impression several times now. I'd like to ask a direct question in return." She looked at Greta steadily. "What specific concern do you have about my conduct, Not my presence, not the impression, my actual conduct. Has anyone observed something improper? Has anyone been harmed by anything I've done? Or is this conversation about the fact that my being here doesn't match what you expected? Silence. One of the women in the back, a younger one Charlotte hadn't seen before, with a careful face and quiet eyes, looked at her hands. "There's the matter of propriety," Greta began. "I saved this man's life," Charlotte said. Still even, still pleasant. Not performing calm, actually calm, with the particular stillness of someone who has decided that this is the ground they're standing on, and it's solid. "I found him dying in the snow, and I pulled him to safety, and I managed his household through his recovery, and I found a fraudulent legal claim against his property, and I helped him protect his land. I have done every part of my job with full professionalism and complete integrity." She looked at Greta. "If the town's concern is with any of that, I'd like to know which part." Another silence, longer this time. The young woman in the back looked up. "I thought it was a very good thing," she said quietly. "What you did, finding him." Three women turned to look at her. She absorbed this without flinching. Her name, Charlotte would learn later, was Ada Morse. She was 26 years old, recently arrived in Red Creek from Minnesota, and she had the expression of someone who had been thinking something quietly for several weeks and had just decided that keeping it quiet wasn't worth it. Greta's jaw tightened. "Ada, she saved his life," Ada said with the simple, frank directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to dress things in enough layers to make them palatable. "And she's done her work, and she hasn't done anything wrong, and I'm not sure what we're here for." The room was extremely quiet. Charlotte looked at Ada Morse and thought with the specific warmth of something unexpected that she hoped she would get to know this woman better. "Mrs. Webb," Charlotte said, turning back to Greta, "you're welcome in this house. Any of you are. But if the conversation you've come to have is about my character rather than my conduct, I don't think it's one I can give you much satisfaction in. I know who I am." She paused. "I've known for a while." Greta Webb stood up with a particular precision that indicated the conversation was over, and that she was choosing to believe it was over on her terms. "We've said what we came to say." "You have," Charlotte agreed. "I hope the coffee was good." She showed them out. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for exactly 10 seconds, and then she went to find something useful to do. Wyatt came in at noon. He came in and looked at her face the way he did now, with the particular attention of someone who had decided that her face was worth paying attention to, and he said, "What happened?" It wasn't a question. She told him. She kept it brief. When she got to the part about Ada Morse, something shifted in his face that she recognized as the expression he wore when something had surprised him in a direction he approved of. "Ada Morse," he said. "You know her. Her husband's the new school teacher," he said. "Thomas Morse. Good man. They came in September." He looked at Charlotte. She spoke up. "She did," Charlotte said. "In front of Greta Webb, who I gather is not a woman who takes disagreement in her own camp lightly." "No," he said. "She is not." He was quiet for a moment. Charlotte went back to what she was doing, the week's accounts as usual, and he went to pour himself coffee, and she could feel him behind her, the way she always felt him now, not intrusive, but present. The particular warmth of a man who occupied the same space as her, and had stopped being someone she needed to manage around. "Charlotte," he said. She looked up. He was holding his coffee cup and looking at her with an expression she had catalogued and not yet named, something that was past the tentative quality of what they'd said to each other 10 days ago, something that had settled further. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You asked me something 10 days ago," she said. "I answered it." "Different question," he said. She waited. He set down the coffee. He was not a man who made large gestures. She knew this about him by now, the way he said important things quietly, the way significance for him was expressed in steadiness rather than flourish. "I want to ask you to stay," he said, "not as the housekeeper, not on a contract. He held her gaze. I want to ask you to stay the way a person stays when they've decided somewhere is home. The account books were open in front of her. The fire was going. The lunch she'd left simmering on the back of the stove was making the kitchen smell like something good and warm. And she had done that, had made this kitchen smell like something again, which it apparently hadn't for 3 years. Wyatt, she said. I know it's fast, he said. I know we've known each other a short while. I know it's not fast, she said. 3 weeks in a place like this, running the way we've run it, that's not fast. That's just condensed. She looked at him. I know you better than I've known most people I've spent years around. Then you know I mean it, he said. I know you mean it, she said. I need you to know what you're asking. Tell me. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. I come with opinions about everything. I'll reorganize things. I'll find the problems before you do sometimes, and that won't always be comfortable. I don't make myself smaller for other people's comfort, and I'm not going to start. She paused. And there will be people in this town who never decide I'm the right kind of person for you to have chosen. Charlotte, he said, I turned you away from my door, and you came back off a road in a blizzard and saved my life. I think we've established that I have room to grow in my judgment of what's right. He held her gaze. And I don't want smaller. I have had smaller. I ran this ranch alone for 3 years, telling myself that smaller was what I needed because bigger meant risking something, and I was done risking things. He stopped. You walked onto my porch and told me I couldn't find the politeness to say what I actually meant, and you were right, and I have been trying to be a man who says what he means ever since. He paused. What I mean is that I want you here, as my wife if you'll have me. And if that's too much too soon, I'll wait. But I wanted it said. The word wife sat in the warm air of the kitchen. Charlotte looked at him for a long time. She thought about the boarding house in Red Creek. She thought about the posting board outside the general store. She thought about 7 doors and the freight hauler from Billings and the letter from Mrs. Halverson that she'd folded and refolded until the creases wore soft. She thought about the road through the blizzard and the shape in the snow, and getting her hands under his arms, and the 150 yards that had rearranged both of their lives without either of them understanding that was what was happening. It's not too much, she said. He stilled. And it's not too soon, she said. She stopped, felt herself smile, which was something she did less easily than most people, and which he had said once very quietly was one of his favorite things about her. It's the right amount, said at the right time. He looked at her. Yes, she said. Is the answer yes? He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. And he was careful with her. She noticed that would always remember that the way he put his hands on her face was careful. The way he looked at her before anything else was careful. Checking that she was sure, checking that she was here, and she was. She was absolutely sure and absolutely here, and when he kissed her, it was with the same quality as everything he did. Quiet, deliberate, and completely without pretense. The stove behind them kept going. The fire in the main room kept burning. Outside, Stick's voice called something to Rupert, and Rupert laughed, and the Callahan ranch continued its ordinary essential work, utterly indifferent to the fact that everything about it had just changed again. She told Hector first. She owed him that. She found him in the barn before supper, and she told him plainly, the way she told him everything. And he was quiet for long enough that she began to read his stillness. Hector, she said, say what you're thinking. He looked at her. His eyes had something in them she hadn't seen before. Not disapproval, she realized. Something closer to relief. I've been running this ranch, he said slowly, since Maggie died. Not the operations that's always been Callahan, but the... He paused, reaching for the word. The keeping of it, the making sure it didn't go cold. He looked at the barn wall. It's been a long 3 years, Miss Bennett. Charlotte, she said. It's been Charlotte for a while now. Charlotte, he said. It's been a long 3 years, and that man has been... He stopped, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He's been holding together with wire and stubbornness. And then you walked up that porch and told him he was wrong, and he looked at you like—" He shook his head. Like someone who'd been in the dark a long time and just heard somebody light a match. She was quiet for a moment. "He told me what she was like," she said. "Maggie. He said she had opinions and didn't soften them." "That's true," Hector said. "He said she drove him half out of his mind." "Also true." "He said she respected her more than almost anyone he'd known." Hector looked at her. "Also true." A pause. 3 out of 3 applies to present company, far as I can see. She looked at the barn floor. That particular warmth again, the one she hadn't built fence against. "Don't make me sentimental, Hector," she said. "I've got supper to manage." "Wouldn't dream of it," he said, and she heard as she left the sound of him chuckling to himself in the barn. She wrote to her brother that night, the youngest one, Thomas, who had the homestead now, and who she wrote to 3 times a year, with the dutiful regularity of a woman who loved her family and also needed significant amounts of distance from them. She wrote him a letter that was, by her standards, almost extravagant. She told him about the ranch and the cold snap and the calves and the account books. She told him about Hector and Stick and Amos, who had sealed her window without being asked, which she said was more than most men had done for her in recent memory. She told him about Wyatt. She was brief about Wyatt, but she was honest, which was the more important thing. He is a man who says what he means and means what he says, and has been honest with me, even when it cost him something, she wrote. "I did not come here looking for any of this. I want you to know that, because you will have thoughts about it, and several of them will be wrong. I came here for work, and I found it, and the rest arrived without being invited, and turned out to be exactly what I did not know I was waiting for. I intend to stay. I thought you should hear that from me." She sealed the letter and left it for the morning post, and went to stand in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the room that she had made into something over the course of a month. The order she had put into it, the warmth she had built back into it, the small accumulation of her own presence, layered over the bones of what had been there before. She had not displaced Maggie Callahan. She had never intended to. But she had quietly, without ceremony, added herself to the house, and the house had held her. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerable. The second large twist arrived the following Tuesday in the form of a letter from the Territorial Land Office in Helena. Wyatt opened it at the kitchen table while Charlotte was working, and the quality of his silence told her what she needed to know before he said a word. She looked up. His face had gone to the careful blankness she recognized as his version of something very large arriving all at once. "What is it?" she said. He looked at her. "There's an inquiry," he said, "from the Territorial Land Office, about the deed release document." She put her pen down. "What kind of inquiry?" "They're questioning its authenticity," he said. He set the letter on the table with a care that suggested he was managing his hands. "Someone, it doesn't say who, has filed a claim with the Land Office, asserting that the release document may be a forgery, that the lien may still be valid." He paused. "That the property title is therefore under dispute pending investigation." Charlotte was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Who filed the claim?" she said. "The letter doesn't say. Anonymous complaint." He looked at the table. "Charlotte, if the release is considered fraudulent, even pending investigation, even before anything's proven, the property title is encumbered. I can't sell, I can't borrow against it, and depending on how the county office reads the situation. You can't guarantee the water rights purchase holds," she said. "No." She picked up the letter. She read it once through quickly, and then again slowly. She was looking for the specific legal language, the citation, the grounds, the specific allegation about the document. She found it. "They're claiming the signature on the release is inconsistent with other documents from the same land office official," she said. "Which it might be," Wyatt said. I'm not an expert in, but I know who would be," Charlotte said. She looked at him. "The Territorial Archive in Helena. Every land office document filed in Montana Territory since 1864 is recorded there. If the original official signed other documents, their signature is on file. A comparison would either confirm the release or invalidate it. She paused. Do you have a lawyer in Billings? Jefferson Crane. He handled the Hanley purchase. Wire him today, she said. Tell him you need him to request a document comparison from the Territorial Archive. Give him the release document and the filing reference from this letter and ask him to move fast because... She stopped. Because if Greer's behind this, Wyatt said, he'll be moving fast too. Yes, she said. He looked at her. How do you know how to do this? Mrs. Halverson had a dispute with a neighboring property over a fence line in 1874, Charlotte said. I helped her manage the correspondence for 8 months. I learned more about territorial property law than I ever intended to. She looked at the letter. This is exactly the kind of challenge someone uses when they can't win through a direct claim. You make the process expensive and exhausting and hope the other person gives up before they get to the truth. Greer? Wyatt said again. Flatter this time. Colder. Probably, she said. But we're not going to say that until we can prove it. We're going to respond to the specific claim in the specific way that makes it go away. She picked up her pen. Let me draft the wire to Crane. She drafted it. He sent it. And then there was nothing to do but wait, which was the hardest part of any legal matter. And Charlotte managed the waiting the way she managed everything, by working. 3 days later, Ada Morse came to the door. Charlotte answered it and found her standing on the porch with a covered dish and the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was committed to it. I brought a pie, Ada said. Dried apple. I make it too sweet, but Thomas likes it that way, and I haven't yet figured out how to make 2 different pies without making myself crazy. She held it out. Can I come in? Charlotte took the pie. Yes, she said. Come in. Ada Morse came into the kitchen and sat at the table with the straightforward quality of someone who was comfortable in kitchens, and Charlotte made coffee and they talked. It was the most natural conversation Charlotte had had with another woman in longer than she could easily remember. Not because Ada was particularly deferential, but because she wasn't, and because she asked direct questions and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. She asked how Charlotte had ended up in Red Creek. She listened to the whole of it without the expressions most people put on when they heard the part about 7 doors, the pity, the discomfort, the reaching for something consoling to say. She just listened, and then she said, That must have been an awful morning. It was, Charlotte said, but the afternoon turned out better. Ada smiled. It was a good smile, quick and genuine. Thomas says Callahan is a different man than he was 6 months ago. He's not. Thomas isn't the gossiping type, but he notices things. He says it's like someone opened a window. Charlotte looked at her coffee. That's a kind way to put it. Is it true? She looked up. Ada was watching her with those quiet, direct eyes. I don't know what he was like 6 months ago, Charlotte said. I only know what he's like now. Is he good to you? Ada said, simply, without drama. Charlotte looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said. He is. Ada nodded. She drank her coffee. Good, she said. That's what matters. They stayed at the table for another hour. By the time Ada left, Charlotte had the sense of something beginning, not a transaction, not an arrangement, but the real and rare thing of a person she might know well, given time. She stood at the door and watched Ada walk down the road toward town, and thought about what it meant to have been places long enough to build something. She had not, in her 24 years, spent much time thinking about that, about the building rather than the surviving. She had been so long in the mode of endurance that expansion had seemed like something that happened to other people. She went back inside. Jefferson Crane wired back in 4 days. The signature matched. The release document was authentic. The land office official's signature on the 1863 release was consistent with 23 other documents in the Territorial Archive from the same period, confirmed in writing by the chief archivist in Helena. Wyatt read the wire at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning with Charlotte sitting across from him, and the expression on his face when he looked up was the one she'd first seen in the office with the wooden crate. The expression of a man who'd been handed back something he thought he'd lost. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. "Greer's out of moves. He's out of legal moves," she said. "Men like Greer find other ways to occupy themselves when the legal ones close off, but they're usually looking for easier targets." She looked at him. "Your property is clean. Your water rights are secured. Your accounts are in order, and your supply costs are down, and you have a clear record of the deed going back to 1861. She paused. "There is nothing here to take." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. "Charlotte," he said. "I know," she said. "I need to say it." "Say it then." "I have been trying," he said slowly and clearly, with the deliberateness of a man who has thought through every word to find a way to tell you what you've done for this place, for me. I keep coming up against the fact that there isn't a word that does it accurately. He held her gaze. "You walked off that road and you saved my life, and then you walked into this house and you saved that too. And I would have lost it, I believe that now, without you." He paused. "Not just to Greer. I would have lost it to myself, to the way I'd been running down without noticing." He stopped. "I want you to know that I know that." She was quiet for a moment. "Wyatt," she said, "I need you to know something too." He waited. "I didn't come here to save anything," she said. "I came here to work. And I found—" She stopped, looked at the table, looked back at him. "I found a place where I could be what I actually am without being asked to make myself smaller. And that is not something I had found before. That is not a small thing to me." She paused. "You asked me to stay. I said yes because I wanted to. Not because you needed me, though you did. Because I wanted this specific thing, this place and this work and—" She stopped again. "You." The word sat between them small and enormous. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. They were married in March. The ceremony was small. The parlor of the Callahan house, Pastor Grimes Hector, and the hands, Ada and Thomas Morse, Mrs. Pruitt, from the boarding house, who cried in the efficient way of a woman who cried at weddings on principle and was not going to apologize for it. Charlotte wore a dress she'd made herself blue, not faded this time, real blue, and she stood next to Wyatt Callahan in the parlor of the house she had made her own and said words she meant completely. Wyatt said his words with the same quality he brought to everything, quiet, deliberate, absolutely without pretense. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, which was the way she had decided somewhere around week 2 that she was never going to take for granted. Afterward, in the kitchen, Hector made a toast with the good whiskey he'd been keeping for a significant occasion, and Stick spilled his immediately and was devastated, and Amos said it was a good day, which from Amos was essentially a speech. Ada hugged Charlotte with the warmth of someone who had decided in approximately one afternoon that she was going to be Charlotte's friend, and had committed to this with the same lack of ceremony with which Charlotte did everything. Mrs. Pruitt took Charlotte's hands before she left and said, "I told Mr. Callahan when he came around asking questions that you were the tidiest guest I'd ever had." "I know," Charlotte said. "He told me. I also told him," Mrs. Pruitt said with the precision of someone who has been waiting to deliver a complete thought, "that a woman who made her bed before breakfast was a woman who understood what kind of world she was living in and intended to deal with it on its own terms." She squeezed Charlotte's hands. "I stand by that." Charlotte smiled, that genuine, not easily given smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt," she said, "for what you said to him." "Don't thank me," Mrs. Pruitt said. "I only told him the truth." Greta Webb did not come. She was not expected. Charlotte had not expected her, and Wyatt had not invited her, and the women of the Ladies' Auxiliary would find over the months that followed that the Callahan household was considerably less interesting as a topic when there was nothing about it that could be made scandalous. Red Creek moved on to other things, the way small towns did, and Charlotte moved with it not as an outsider, negotiating the edges, but as a woman who lived there, who was known there, who was Wyatt Callahan's wife, and ran his accounts and made biscuits that Amos considered the finest in the county. Ada. Morse came to the house on Thursdays. They drank coffee and talked without performing, and disagreed about things without consequence, and Charlotte found in this something she had not known she was missing, the particular sustenance of a woman friend who asked real questions and gave real answers, and did not require you to be smaller to fit the friendship. Dale, in the end, became her most reliable defender in town. Not immediately, it took him until April, and it took a specific incident in the supply store where he heard something unpleasant said about Charlotte and responded to it with a directness that surprised even him. He told Hector about it afterward with the slightly baffled air of a man discovering something about himself he hadn't expected. Hector told Charlotte. Charlotte did not mention it to Dale, but she made sure his biscuits were extra good for a week. Dale noticed. He didn't say anything either, but he showed up on time every day, and the supply shed stayed organized. In April, on a warm evening that was the first real promise that the winter was done, Wyatt found her on the East Ridge. She went up there sometimes. Not to visit the grave exactly, or not only that. The view was part of it, the way it let her see the whole of the valley and the whole of the ranch, the scale of the thing they were building together. She went when she needed to think clearly, which was something the ridge was reliably good for. He came and stood beside her. "I figured you'd be up here," he said. "I come to think," she said. "I know." He stood beside her close, but not crowding her in the way he always stood, aware of her space, respectful of it, but making it clear he was there. "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the valley. The creek was running free again, the ice out of it, and the pastures had the beginning of green in them that looked tentative and real at the same time. "My mother," she said, surprising herself slightly with the honesty of it. He was quiet, waiting. "She was a practical woman," Charlotte said. "She had to be. We all had to be. But she used to say—" She stopped. She used to say that a life was measured by what it held, not what it looked like from the outside, what it actually held. She looked at the valley. "I think about her sometimes, about what she would think. About this, about me," Charlotte said, "about who I turned out to be." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you think she'd say?" Charlotte was quiet too. She thought about her mother's hands always working, her mother's voice always direct, her mother's particular way of looking at the world, which was with the frank, unsentimental attention of a woman who loved it anyway. "I think she'd say, 'I held on too long to the wrong things,'" Charlotte said. "And then I let go at the right time." She paused. "And she'd want to see the kitchen." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the full kind, not the ghost of one, and she turned to look at him when he did it the way she always did, because his full laugh was something she had decided early on was something worth turning to look at. "I'll tell you what you hold," he said when the laugh had settled. "Don't," she said. "You'll make me sentimental." "Charlotte." "Wyatt." He took her hand. She let him. They stood on the ridge in the April evening with the valley below them, and it was warm for the first time in months. Genuinely warm, and the ranch was going, and the land was clean, and the accounts were sound, and there were calves in the south barn, and biscuits on the kitchen counter. And Ada Morse was coming on Thursday, and Amos had already sourced the material for the new fence line, and the life that she had built out of blizzard and stubbornness, and a letter from an honest woman, and 150 yards of snow was arranged below her in its entirety. "Do you know what I love most about you?" he said. She glanced at him. "My accounts." "No." "My biscuits." "No." "My filing system," she said. "It's genuinely very good." "Charlotte." His voice was warm. "Your heart." She was quiet. She was a woman who did not say things she didn't mean, who did not accept things she didn't believe, who had spent 24 years building herself into someone the world could not easily dismiss. She was stubborn and capable and opinionated, and she managed money and livestock and difficult men with equal competence, and she had not in all that time made herself smaller for anyone. She did not intend to start, but she could feel standing on that ridge in the first real warmth of the year, with her hand in his, and the whole of their life visible below her, the particular truth that a woman could be entirely and unapologetically herself, and still hold someone's hand on an April evening, and feel the rightness of it all the way down. "I know," she said. She leaned into him slightly, just slightly, the way you lean into something you trust to hold. He held. Below them, Red Creek went about its business. The valley went about its spring. The Callahan Ranch, warm and running and whole, went about the steady essential work of a place that had found its way back to being a home. And Charlotte Bennett. Charlotte Callahan. Now, though she would always be Bennett, in the part of herself that had walked off that road in a blizzard, and decided that no man's door closing on her, was the last word, stood on the ridge, and breathed the April air, and felt for the first time in longer than she could name that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because the world had finally decided she deserved it, because she had never stopped believing she did.